Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors meeting. Excuse me, can I have order in the chamber, please? Can you please keep your voices down so that we can get started with the meeting? Thank you very much. There is an overflow room in room 263. Thank you all so much for being here. And welcome to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors meeting of September 22nd, 2015. Madam Clerk, can you please call the roll?
Thank you, Madam President. Supervisor Avalos. Avalos present. President Breed.
Here.
Breed present. Supervisor Campos. Campos present. Supervisor Christensen. Christensen not present. Christensen present. Supervisor Cohen. Cohen present. Supervisor Farrell. Farrell present. Supervisor Kim. Kim not present. Supervisor Marr. Marr present. Supervisor Tang. Tang present. Supervisor Wiener. Wiener present. Supervisor Yee. Yee present. Madam President, there is a quorum present.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, can you please join us for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Has to be clear. Let's go, John.
Madam Clerk, are there any communications?
I have no communications, Madam President.
Will you please read the consent agenda?
Items 1 through 4 comprise the consent calendar. These items are considered routine. If a member objects, an item may be removed and considered separately.
Okay. Seeing no members on the roster, Madam Clerk, can you call the roll?
On items 1 through 4, Supervisor Farrell. Farrell, aye. Supervisor Kim. Kim, aye. Supervisor Marr. Marr, aye. Supervisor Tang. Tang, aye. Supervisor Wiener. Wiener, aye. Supervisor Yee. Yee, aye. Supervisor Avalos. Avalos, aye. Supervisor Breed.
Aye.
Breed, aye. Supervisor Campos.
Aye.
Campos, aye. Supervisor Christensen. Christensen, aye. Supervisor Cohen. Cohen, aye. There are 11 ayes.
Those items are approved unanimously. Next item, please.
Item 5 is an ordinance to amend the Administrative Code to rename the Disaster Recovery Fund as the San Francisco Disaster Recovery Emergency Response and Recovery Fund, and to designate it as a Category 8 fund and specify how the city will use the fund.
Roll call vote.
On item 5, Supervisor Farrell.
Aye.
Farrell, aye. Supervisor Kim.
Aye.
Kim, aye. Supervisor Marr. Marr, aye. Supervisor Tang.
Aye.
Tang, aye. Supervisor Wiener. Wiener, aye. Supervisor Yee.
Aye.
Yee, aye. Supervisor Avalos. Avalos, no. Supervisor Breed.
Aye.
Breed, aye. Supervisor Campos.
Aye.
Campos, aye. Supervisor Christensen.
Aye.
Christensen, aye. Supervisor Cohen.
Sorry.
Cohen, aye. There are 10 ayes and 1 no, with Supervisor Avalos in the dissent.
Okay, the ordinance is finally passed.
Madam President, I believe Supervisor Campos wanted to rescind the vote.
My apologies, Madam President. Colleagues, I'm sorry. I'd like to make a motion to rescind the vote.
Okay, Supervisor Campos has made a motion to rescind the vote, seconded by Supervisor Farrell. Colleagues, can we take this without objection? Without objection, the vote has been rescinded. Madam Clerk, can you call the roll on item number 5?
On item 5, Supervisor Farrell.
Aye.
Farrell, aye. Supervisor Kim.
Aye.
Kim, aye. Supervisor Marr. Marr, aye. Supervisor Tang.
Aye.
Tang, aye. Supervisor Wiener.
Aye.
Wiener, aye. Supervisor Yee.
No.
Yee, no. Supervisor Avalos. Avalos, no. Supervisor Breed.
Aye.
Breed, aye. Supervisor Campos.
No.
Campos, no. Supervisor Christensen.
Aye.
Christensen, aye. Supervisor Cohen. Cohen, aye. There are 8 ayes and 3 noes, with Supervisors Yee, Avalos, and Campos in the dissent.
The ordinance is finally passed. Next item, please.
Item 6 is an ordinance to authorize the Department of Human Resources to accept and expend a $135,000 grant from the Fuse Corps, which prepares students for careers in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and to amend the annual salary ordinance for a grant-funded position in 0922 Manager 1 from September 28, 2015 through September 30th, 2016.
Roll call vote.
On item 6, Supervisor Farrell.
Aye.
Farrell, aye. Supervisor Kim.
Aye.
Kim, aye. Supervisor Marr.
Aye.
Marr, aye. Supervisor Tang.
Aye.
Tang, aye. Supervisor Wiener. Wiener, aye. Supervisor Yee?
Aye.
Yee, aye. Supervisor Avalos?
Aye.
Avalos, aye. Supervisor Breed?
Aye.
Breed, aye. Supervisor Campos? Campos, aye. Supervisor Christensen?
Aye.
Christensen, aye. Supervisor Cohen? Cohen, aye. There are 11 ayes.
The ordinance is finally passed unanimously. Item 7, please.
Item 7 is a resolution to approve the Fourth Amendment to the agreement with PRWT Services for citation processing and support to extend the agreement by 1 year to October 31st, 2016, with an option to extend for 2 further years, and to increase the agreement by $9.2 million for a total not to exceed amount of approximately $62.7 million.
Same House, same call. Without objection, the resolution is adopted unanimously. Item 8, please.
Item 8, resolution to approve and authorize the acquisition of a temporary construction easement, a permanent subsurface electrical easement, a permanent subsurface well connection easement, and a subsurface utility water connection easement from Costco Wholesale Corporation for $190,000 to be used by the city for the Water System Improvement Program Regional Groundwater Storage and Recovery Project.
Same House, same call. Without objection, the resolution is adopted unanimously. Madam Clerk, can you call items number 9 and 10 together?
Item 9 is an ordinance to amend the planning code by revising the zoning map to rezone a portion of Daggett Street between 16th Street and 7th Street from urban mixed use 68 Height and Bolt District to public open space as part of the establishment of Daggett Park, to approve an ordinance to approve an agreement with the Port of San Francisco and Archstone Daggett Place for the land transfer, to authorize an interdepartmental transfer for street vacation, gift acceptance, encroachment permit, and related actions to facilitate the exchange.
Supervisor Cohen.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, these 2 items here before us today will help deliver a new 1-acre open space park to the Potrero Hill community known as Daggett Park. And as part of the Eastern Neighborhoods Plan communities who accepted growth and increased density, they were promised an array of public benefits and amenities that would include new public parks and open space. So after a number of years of negotiations, land acquisition, and securing all of the necessary resources for this park, the actions before us today will deliver on one of those promises. The structure of this transaction ensures that the community receives desperately needed new open space, that the city has a mechanism to ensure that it's maintained in perpetuity. The package of legislation before us today sets out all of the necessary approvals needed to create this new park. It also includes rezoning this space to a public use. It vacates a street. It allows the city to accept this as a gift of maintenance of the park, and also approves the necessary encroachment permits that are needed. So, colleagues, I hope that you'll support these items today. They came out of the Land Use Committee with a positive recommendation. I hope to have your support. Thank you.
Thank you. With that, colleagues, can we take these items, same House, same call? Without objection, these ordinances pass unanimously on the first reading. Item number 11.
Item 11 is an ordinance to amend the administrative code to consider amendments to the residential rent stabilization and arbitration ordinance.
Supervisor Kim.
Thank you, President Breed. Today, the board has the opportunity to support one of the strongest tenant protection legislations and curb the rise of frivolous evictions that we are seeing here in San Francisco, where the primary motivation is greed, and also work to stabilize our existing residents here in San Francisco. We all know the stats already. According to the recent Rent Board's annual eviction report, there are 2,120 notices of eviction filed with the Rent Board for the year ending February 28, 2015. That is a 54.7% increase from 5 years ago. Thanks to tenant organizing and to attention by the media, we have now seen a decline in Ellis Act eviction notices over the last year. Yet what we are seeing instead is a rise in the number of low-fault evictions, which increased by 82.5% over the last 5 years. And we know that the actual number of evictions and displacement is likely much higher, as many evictions go unreported to the Rent Board. As evidenced by the citywide housing balance report that was released this past July, authored by our office, San Francisco is, quote, essentially running in place on affordable housing in what has become the most expensive housing market in the country. We added 6,559 units of affordable housing over the last 10 years, but in the same period lost 5,470 rent-controlled apartments, often are affordable and middle-class housing in San Francisco, from protected status through a variety of no-fault and low-fault evictions allowed by state law. This data demonstrates that our anti-eviction work is every bit as important as our work to support the construction of new affordable housing. According to the Rent Board's annual eviction report, the 5 leading cases of evictions in order of frequency are 1, breach of lease, 2, nuisance, 3, owner move-in, 4, Ellis Act, and then 5, finally, illegal use. While there has been much attention on no-fault evictions like Ellis Act and owner move evictions, we're finding that actually the leading cause of evictions, breach of lease, nuisance, and illegal use, are the ones that are increasing, while Ellis and owner move-in evictions have been on the decline. Our office is overwhelmed with requests for assistance by tenants who are being evicted, primarily seniors, immigrants, and residents with disabilities. I know many of us have heard the stories of eviction, so I will only share one at the board today. Sylvia Smith, who has been a face for this legislation, is one of the many tenants being targeted by the same landlord who is evicting several tenants across 9 buildings in the Mission, the Castro, and North Beach. Sylvia is a disabled senior and a former U.S. postal worker. She stated that, quote, since the landlord bought the building 1 year ago, I've received numerous notices of ridiculous accusations, including being a drug dealer, and now she's evicting me because her grandsons have moved in. And now she's evicting me because my grandsons have moved in with me in order to take care of me as I get older and because of my disability. Because of this eviction, I've only become sicker from the stress. Many of the residents that receive these evictions, as I mentioned, are predominantly seniors, residents with disabilities, and immigrants, and our housing counselors are overwhelmed by these cases. In fact, even sadder, we sometimes meet them after they've been evicted and can't find other housing. A couple of months ago, when I visited the opening of the Navigation Center in the Mission in Supervisor David Campos' district, I met a senior who was at the Navigation Center. I asked her how long she had been living on the streets, and she stated she had only been living on the streets of the Mission for 6 months. I asked her how she ended up sleeping on our streets, and she stated that she had been evicted from her home of decades in the Mission when a new property owner bought her building this past year. This legislation was directly brought to us by tenants and housing counselors who have seen the patterns in evictions in their caseload, along with hundreds of tenants. And I want to recognize Supervisor Avalos, Campos, and Marr, who are co-authors of this legislation, and the city attorney who worked with us to make these amendments to the rent ordinance. And I wanted to summarize the amendments that are included in the legislation before us today. 1, to require that eviction notices be published in multiple languages and include information to tenants on where they can get help. Requiring landlords to publish notices in English, Chinese, Vietnamese, Tagalog, and Russian, and the tenant's right to seek legal assistance or information from the rent board. 2, stop low-fault evictions based on harmless mistakes. Landlords must provide proof of alleged violation. 2 years ago, we had a senior Russian family who came to our office because they got an eviction from their below-market rate unit. Their son was accused of using drugs, but there was no proof offered whatsoever. So that these accusations were true. 3, give tenants a chance to cure. Tenants must be given a reasonable amount of time to cure petty violations. We recently heard a few months ago of seniors and residents in Chinatown that were being evicted from their single-room occupancy hotel simply because they were hanging laundry outside of their window. We've also heard from tenants who've gotten eviction notice for leaving their bike in the hallway or their baby stroller in the lobby. This would allow tenants to cure the violation or breach of lease before eviction. 4, this clarifies that housing that is not authorized for residential occupancy, such as dwelling units in commercial spaces or in-laws, should be the sole reason for eviction. And I want to recognize Supervisor Malia Cohen, who also sees a lot of illegal uses in her district, who offered a friendly amendment last week to clarify that when a unit is unable to be legalized, a property owner is not forced to simply allow the tenant to stay in that unsafe unit or continue to reside there. Finally, this amendment codifies vacancy rent control, allowable currently under state law, into our local rent ordinance. It codifies state law that a landlord or property owner that terminates a lease or requires a tenant to temporarily relocate because of an owner move-in, condo conversion, capital repair, or lead remediation work, that the following tenant or the current tenant that moves in at the rent of the departing tenant. I also want to recognize Supervisor Wiener, who suggested an amendment that I accepted of setting this cap to 5 years, which I believe is reasonable for the number of units, for the number of years that the vacancy control provision is applicable to the unit. Taken together, this package of reasonable amendments provides protections for our most vulnerable tenants during the speculative housing market, and it also takes the greed motivation out of the evictions that we are currently seeing. These important amendments will have a large impact on our most vulnerable residents and reduce the incentive to bring forth cases clearly aimed to clear units in order to re-rent at a higher rent. I want to recognize the many tenants that worked with our office to help close these loopholes and help shape this legislation. I also want to recognize several groups that have been working on this legislation over the past 6 months. The Bill Soro Housing Program, Casa Justa, Chinatown Community Development Center, Community Tenants Association, the District 8 Democrats, Eviction Defense Collaborative, Housing Rights Committee of San Francisco Tenants Union, Senior Disability Action, South of Market Community Action Network, Tenants Together, and Tenderloin Housing Clinic. And finally, I just want to recognize 2 of my staff members, April Veneracion, who started this legislation, and Ivy Lee, who spent countless hours working with many different stakeholders to really strike the right balance to ensure that we were protecting our vulnerable tenants who are being evicted out of greed, but making sure that we put in protections for landlords as well so they wouldn't be exploited by some bad tenants. So, colleagues, I ask for your support today, and I look forward to the discussion on this proposed legislation.
Thank you, Supervisor Kim. And before we move on, I just wanted to let the public know that the overflow room of room 263 is full. However, the North Light Court is open for anyone who would like to watch the proceedings. Supervisor Wiener.
Thank you very much, Madam President. And I want to just thank Supervisor Kim for bringing forward this important issue during this housing crisis where it's just hard to believe when you see some of the rents that are being charged. It seems like it can never get worse, and then it gets worse yet again, and it's completely out of control. And one of the most important things that we can do, in addition to building affordable housing, is to keep people stable in the housing that they have, and that means making sure that people are not being pushed out, particularly due to bogus lease violations. And I want to thank Supervisor Kim for raising a particular landlord. She was politic enough not to mention the name. I will, as I did in committee, a sociopathic individual by the name of Anna Kahagi, who has been buying up buildings largely in my district and then literally terrorizing the tenants to get them out of the buildings. And the horror stories that we have heard and in meeting with these tenants and hearing what the daily lives, what they have to live with, that no human being should ever have to go through. And what she's doing is actually highly illegal under current law, under long existing law, which is why the city attorney wisely is suing her, and her behavior has no place in San Francisco. It's important to acknowledge that most landlords don't engage in that kind of behavior. There are people who do bad and illegal and harassing things, and there are many landlords who don't. By the same token, we have heard from some landlords about abusive tenants, and although there certainly are some tenants who are abusive and violating the lease or the law, the vast majority of tenants are simply trying to lead their lives. And so we're in a situation where the large majority of people, whether you're a tenant or a landlord, are just trying to go about their lives or conduct their business, and you have some people either on the tenant side or the landlord side who are doing inappropriate things. And so when we're making law, we have to make sure that we're making a law that's going to apply wisely to everyone, and that is going to allow a robust rental market where we can keep tenants stable in their housing and also have well-managed buildings. I support and will be voting today for the significant majority of this legislation, with one exception, which I'll get to in a minute. And I want to thank the Land Use Committee for accepting 2 of the 3 amendments that I offered in committee, and I want to thank both the tenant and the property owner advocates for working collaboratively to come up with good solutions. I completely agree. People should not be evicted from their units for minor lease violations. Minor lease violations are, I think, inherently pretextual, and some of the stories we hear about laundry or people painting a wall that they weren't supposed to paint, things like that, people should not be evicted for that. And so I am very supportive of making sure that we limit these kind of evictions to really serious violations where you're impacting not just the landlord but other tenants in the buildings. And so the language around evictions for so-called nuisance violations, we were able to work with both the tenant groups and the landlord groups to come up with really focused language and to say that in order to evict for a nuisance, it has to be either severe or recurring or continuing. It can't just be a minor violation. And so I think that's really great language, and I'm glad that we were able to get that done. In addition, the language that we amended around owner move-in evictions, the way it was initially drafted, if someone did an owner move-in and then lived in the unit for 25 years and then moved out and rented it, you would have to go with the 25-year-old rent. And that would just create an incentive to do Ellis Act evictions, because under the Ellis Act, after 5 years, you can rent at market rate. And the last thing we want to do is incentivize Ellis Act evictions, particularly because an owner move-in eviction is of one unit, an Ellis Act eviction is of the entire building. And so again, I want to thank the committee and Supervisor Kim, the author, for accepting that amendment. I think it makes it a better vehicle. So there's a lot of good stuff in this legislation that will protect tenants and keep people stable in their housing. The one section that I cannot support, which I voted against in committee and which I will be voting against today as well, is the section that basically eliminates, in my view, effectively eliminates a landlord's ability to limit the number of residents living in a building, and really raises it up to the fire code, as opposed to the landlord having any ability through a lease to manage the number of residents in a building. I support having flexibility in people bringing in roommates. Our current code has a fair amount of flexibility. It allows people to bring in their child, parent, grandchild, grandparent, brother or sister, or spouse or domestic partner right now, regardless of what the lease says. You can bring those family members, not just direct family members, but even a grandparent, a grandchild, a spouse, or a domestic partner in. In addition, 15 years ago, the board adopted legislation allowing for roommate swaps. So if you have a roommate who moves out, you can bring in another roommate, which makes a lot of sense, because if someone's depending on a roommate to help make rent, we don't want them to lose the unit because the roommate got married or moved out of state. And so I support that. As I indicated in committee, I would be supportive of having some additional flexibility to allow someone to bring one additional roommate in. But what I can't support is when a landlord rents, say, a 2-bedroom apartment to someone, and then that person can then bring in 3 roommates immediately without really effectively any say-so by the landlord. And it doesn't just affect the landlord, it affects other tenants in the building, because if all of a sudden the number of people living in the building doubles or quadruples, that affects every single person living in that building. And even though a landlord can technically try to withhold consent, the way this is drafted, they effectively cannot withhold consent, particularly based on the number of people occupying the units. So I would be supportive of some additional flexibility around roommates. I can't support this because of how far it goes. I think it will have a lot of unintended consequences, and so I will be asking at the conclusion, or I'd like to request now, that we separate the question, and so we separately vote on page 8, line 9, through page 9, line 11, that approximately one page having to do with subtenants. I'll be voting in favor of everything else and voting against that one discrete subsection. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Weiner. Supervisor Yee.
Thank you, President Bree. I also want to thank Supervisor Kim for authoring this piece of legislation. It's something that really needs to be done. Many of the provisions that are in there, I'm fully supportive. In regards to the low fault types of evictions, we don't want that to be a rampant situation in San Francisco. So I think this will act to counteract that. I think a lot of what Supervisor Weiner has said, I agree with, and I want to be supportive of this piece of legislation, but the one piece that I do have some concerns about is the one that Supervisor Weiner pointed out, the provision in which this legislation, especially the one I'm talking about, the roommate provision. While I understand the affordable crisis that the city is going through, I believe in the basic principle of respecting the terms of the contract, and I'm uncomfortable with changing those terms without a thorough conversation between the two parties. So, colleagues, I will be supporting the call to separate the question on this one.
Thank you, Supervisor Yee. Supervisor Tang.
Thank you. I too would like to thank the author of this legislation. I know that it's disheartening when we see news articles that basically say that there are no neighborhoods in San Francisco that are affordable for renters. And so, like my colleagues before me, Supervisors Weiner and Yee, I do agree with the majority of the legislation, especially when it comes to the minor issues that landlords are seeking to evict some of the tenants for. But I do have some questions regarding and my comments will all be centered around the provision regarding additional occupants under this legislation. And so I had received some conflicting information about what the rights of the additional occupants would be. So, for example, if I'm a master leaseholder in a tenancy, and I decide that I'm going to bring on, a friend or two to join me in my living situation, what rights do those individuals have? And I think that there are also different terms, whether they're a tenant, they're a subtenant, they're a sublessee, they're a co-tenant, and what rights do those come with? So I'm wondering if maybe both the City Attorney's Office as well as the Rent Board can answer that question for me.
Supervisors, Jolene Wolf, Executive Director of the Rent Board. Under the rent ordinance, a subtenant is considered a tenant. However, a subtenant does not, their landlord is the master tenant, the person who brings them in, as long as they continue to pay rent to that person and not to the landlord. If they continue to pay rent to the landlord and the landlord starts treating them as a tenant, for example, putting their name on rent increase notices or taking repair requests for them, they can actually create a landlord-tenant relationship by doing that. Otherwise, if they steer clear of those kind of behaviors, then the person who gets brought in, as long as that subtenant pays rent to the person that brought them in, then their tenancy, once the last original occupant is gone, the landlord could raise the rent pursuant to state law, Costa-Hawkins, and actually the tenancy is, as my lawyers tell me, the tenancy can be extinguished under operation of law. The landlord should avoid approving them as a tenant, and creating a landlord-tenant relationship with them is kind of the linchpin.
So then in a situation where, let's say that I'm a master leaseholder and I decide I want to bring on additional roommates, what if we get into a dispute? What happens then? So I'm a tenant, but I'm also serving as a landlord. And these things do happen. I think it's naive for us to think that that doesn't occur, especially when you're living so close together. So if you can explain what would...
It happens all the time.
Parties.
Whenever I get those calls, I just want to say, let's go to community boards and work it out. What happens is that the master tenant has the right to evict their subtenant without a just cause reason, which landlords need a just cause reason in rent-controlled units to evict. But a master tenant, because people shouldn't have to live together if they brought somebody in and then it doesn't work out, but they have to disclose at the inception of the tenancy to that subtenant that, by the way, as your master tenant, I can evict you without a just cause reason. If they don't give them that disclosure at the inception of the tenancy, it's not going to be a pretty picture.
I mean, so what happens in that situation where it wasn't disclosed upon inception?
Then they do not have the right to evict unless absent a just cause reason, just like a landlord would have to have.
And so I, as, say, a master leaseholder, I would, what kind of recourse do I have? I have to seek private legal action or in order
Anytime
to get my
you're talking eviction, people are penny wise and pound foolish not to seek legal help.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and again, I ask these questions because I think that, one of my concerns was we are trying to help tenants, in this situation by allowing, master leaseholders to bring on additional occupants, but in some cases, some of the additional occupants that will be joining a master leaseholder may not actually have, full protections that a typical tenant would have. And so that is one of my concerns. But also then, let's just say, what happens if, say, I'm a master leaseholder and I need to move out of the city? What happens to the additional friends that I brought on board?
Well, it depends. If they were unapproved subtenants holding over at the expiration of your tenancy, then that is just cause reason for landlords to evict. If the landlord approves them and subsequent to our rules and regulations, additional occupants, we have procedures for the landlords to approve them. They're not allowed to unreasonably withhold consent. And when they become approved subtenants, if the last original tenant vacates, they can't be evicted absent a just cause reason from the landlord, but their rent can probably be increased to market under Costa-Hawkins when the last original tenant no longer permanently resides on the premises. And in this market, a rent increase to market is tantamount to an eviction.
Okay. And so what if it wasn't voluntary that I decided I needed to leave? There was actually a just cause eviction. And again, I'm the master leaseholder, but what happens to everyone else I brought on board?
Well, as I said, it depends on if they're approved subtenants by the landlord and through our rules and regulations, or if they're unapproved. If they're unapproved, the landlord can evict. That's a just cause reason for eviction on the rent ordinance, unapproved subtenants holding over. If they're approved, then the landlord would have to have a just cause reason to evict. It wouldn't matter if you left for good reason, bad reason, whatever reason. They'd have to have a just cause reason. And if they did not, then they would probably just effectuate a Costa-Hawkins rent increase, which would constructively evict the subtenants anyway.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I mean, again, I wanted to clarify this on the record because I had heard otherwise. I think yesterday, my understanding originally was that the additional occupants would actually not have the full rights under the rent ordinance here in San Francisco. And so that was a huge concern. But I see here that it really depends on kind of what the situation is, what the landlord, how they've recognized or not recognized the additional occupants in the building. Mm-hmm. Okay. So thank you for answering those questions. I mean, I think that, even with that clarification, I do worry about this particular provision. Even myself as a tenant in a rent-controlled building, I find this provision very troubling. I entered into an agreement with my landlord knowing that there would be a certain number of units. I do have issues with some of the tenants in the building, and whether it's noise or whatnot, I don't think it would justify an eviction. But trying to imagine that there would be additional occupants brought onto the building, what it means for our communal resources, what it means in terms of additional people in our building who I may not know, who are not actually maybe written into a lease. I think all those are concerns that I have. And so, at this time, I think I would not be able to support that particular provision, but would be able to support the rest of the legislation.
Thank you, Supervisor Tang. Supervisor Cohen.
Thank you very much. I too have a couple questions. First, I think that Supervisor Kim, thank you for bringing this before us. I think it's a healthy discussion for us to have here at the board as we continue to battle and grapple with this crisis. The legislation that we are dealing with also still provides for the landlords to petition the rent board for an increase based on new occupants to cover the cost of additional building maintenance and utilities, which is reasonable. Is that correct, Ms. Wolf?
It does provide for a landlord to file a petition to recover the additional costs. Whether it's reasonable or not depends on if you're talking to the landlords in the room or the tenants.
Okay. And I was wondering if you yourself, as a professional in dealing at the Rent Stabilization Board for years, if you had an opinion specifically on this one clause that we're kind of teasing out and discussing today about additional occupants or roommates.
I'm here to give you information about what my law provides for,
Okay.
but the policy decisions are obviously up to you.
Okay, fair enough. So what, one of the scenarios that I've heard, and Supervisor Tank actually gave a great illustration of something that I'm concerned about. So I'm living in a one-bedroom apartment for this example, and I bring in a roommate. This is a rent-controlled unit, and what happens when now there's two adults living in the one-bedroom apartment, which, correct me if I'm wrong, is allowable under the state code?
I'm not familiar with state codes, but I do believe two individuals would be allowed in a one-bedroom apartment.
Okay. And what happens if the utilities begin to go up? Is that cost passed on to the landlord, or is it passed on to the two tenants?
The landlord, we have a provision for utility pass-through in our ordinance, and a landlord can pass through the increased cost of utilities. They don't have to file a petition at our office, but they do have to calculate it correctly. Where it gets difficult is in small buildings, a lot of which don't have meters, separate meters, so it does get a little bit dicey. But there are provisions for the pass-through of increased utility costs.
Okay. The current draft legislation allows for an unlimited additional tenant beyond any rental agreement or lease provision up to the allowance under the housing code. What Supervisor Wiener is proposing would allow for up to one additional tenant in a unit beyond any rental agreement or lease provision up to the allowance under the housing code, in addition to any other allowances under existing law. Is that, we are on the same page?
I believe that's what he's suggesting.
That is what he's suggesting. Have you seen in your years of experience any conflicts that would relate to Supervisor Wiener's amendment?
Supervisor Wiener's amendment is certainly more conservative than the language in the legislation. So it would, if there was conflict that would arise from it, I imagine there would be less.
Okay, I understand. I guess it's inevitable conflict would naturally arise. So it seems that that this issue is both one of the main purposes
Through the
of
President,
legislation.
excuse me, Supervisor Cohen, through the President to Supervisor Cohen, I don't believe that was the specific part of Supervisor Wiener's amendment.
Okay, thank you for that clarification.
I didn't make an amendment.
Okay, that's my interpretation of what I understood his language to be.
And I said it wrongly, the divided portion.
The divided portion. Okay, well, could you state for us the divided portion then?
Basically, I'll call Supervisor Wiener after members on the roster that hadn't had a chance to speak are able to speak.
All right, thank you. Then I'll just reserve the rest of my comments for that particular portion of the discussion.
Okay.
Thank you.
Supervisor Campos.
Thank you. I'd like to just ask Supervisor Kim if she can sort of expand on sort of the comments that were made and respond to some of the comments that were made. I guess perhaps I'm missing the point here, but I am very troubled by the discussion that would actually remove this section of the ordinance, because respectfully, I think that this conversation that would essentially limit the protections that are given to tenants in terms of adding additional tenants is very problematic to me, because I think it's disconnected from the reality of what's happening in San Francisco. The fact is that the only way that so many people can live in San Francisco is because they have a lot of people living in an apartment. I can tell you that the young people that I have worked with in City Hall and through different efforts, a number of them have multiple roommates. And that's the way that folks are able to afford to live in San Francisco. And so the idea that somehow we are limiting the ability of people to do that is very problematic to me. And I think it's actually is going to make a housing crisis even worse. The second piece, having been a tenant for most of my life, especially with immigrant communities, I have to say that my family's concept of what it means to be a family unit, to live in an apartment, might be different from that of other people. And for many immigrant communities, there's a different relationship that the family, or definition of what it means to be a family living under one household. And I don't know that limiting the ability of people to do this actually helps, and it could actually disproportionately impact some communities as well. So I'm very troubled by this, and I'd like to ask the author if she can respond to some of these comments, because it seems to me that if we are taking this portion of the ordinance out, that we might actually be defeating the purpose of what we're trying to do to begin with. Thank you.
Okay. So are you asking a question,
Supervisor
or can
Kim.
we get back to Supervisor Kim after other supervisors have had an opportunity to speak? You want a question answered?
Yeah.
Okay. Supervisor Kim?
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify a couple of things, because I think there's some misunderstandings about the legislation. First of all, landlords always have a right of reasonable refusal to a tenant request to add roommates. And in fact, a tenant has no recourse if the landlord decides to refuse the additional occupant. The landlord's decision cannot be based purely on the number of occupants. It should be based on what our housing, building, and fire code allows. But if there is a different reason for refusal, for example, overuse of common area, that would be considered potentially a reasonable reason to refuse the tenant's request to add a roommate. What is reasonable will be determined by the rent board and has not been curtailed or dictated by us, the Board of Supervisors, in how landlords can provide that discretion. Roommates added pursuant to Eviction Protection 2.0 will not become automatic leaseholders. This is something that has been talked about as a Trojan horse, where a tenant will sneak in additional tenants who will gain tenants' rights as soon as the landlord screens the subtenant, runs a credit check, or accepts rent from one of the subtenants, and that is not true. And I think Ms. Wolf kind of delineated how that relationship could occur. And actually, I should say, I left a rent-controlled unit, and my then roommate replaced me with a different roommate. The landlord refuses to accept his checks. He is not on the lease. He has lived there for over 10 years. And when my roommate moves out of that unit, the individual that is left in the unit will not be protected by the lease, and therefore the landlord can raise the rent on my friend who moved in 2 years after me. So I just wanted to clarify that. Also, the landlord can petition the rent board for additional cost and request a rent increase. This codifies state law that automatic rent increases for additional occupants are as specified in the lease are not legal. However, rent increases should be based on the actual increase in costs that are accrued by the property owner. I'll just say this finally, in terms of how number of occupants are set by landlords. I don't think that this should be set arbitrarily. We have a housing, building, and fire code that determines what the maximum number of occupants are allowed. This is not an unlimited number of roommates. We have a reasonable code too. San Francisco itself does not set unreasonable number of occupants per unit. It is 2, for a studio, it is 3 for a one-bedroom, it is 4 for a two-bedroom. We are not talking about overcrowded situations. This should determine the maximum number of occupants, not arbitrary decisions by landlords. That being said, a landlord can refuse an additional tenant again based on a reasonable reason that is not based purely on number. And I just want to also emphasize that this roommate provision is very much a middle-of-the-road provision. We could have written it in a way that was much stronger for tenants, but we want to make sure that it was reasonable to the landlords and the community and neighborhood as well.
Thank you, Supervisor Kim. Supervisor Marr.
Thank you to Supervisor Kim for the explanation of the questions posed by Supervisor Campos. I wanted to especially thank Supervisor Malia Cohen and the Land Use Committee also for 2 very long public hearings with lots of information, but really making sure that this Just Cause 2.0 legislation got to the full board for our deliberations. I wanted to say, too, that the tenant movement working with Supervisor Kim's office have been very clear that these are sensible and reasonable reforms, that are common sense reforms. They're not going to stop speculation and the displacement that's going on and the loopholes that lawyers and the speculators are using to displace so many people in all of our neighborhoods. But just like software is upgraded regularly with fixes for bug fixes and other things, Just Cause 2.0 is our tenant movement and community groups' effort to try to close those loopholes with small fixes, but it's meaningful to the many thousands of people that are currently facing evictions, gotcha evictions and other types of evictions, or those that like me as a renter too, fearing that something I might do might be used as an excuse for a gotcha eviction. I also wanted to thank Supervisor Campos for raising the importance of the reasonable limits on the roommates portion of the legislation. It's really important to keep into the legislation as well. So thank you to Supervisor Kim, the tenant organizations, and to Supervisor Cohen for making sure that this got to the full board.
Thank you, Supervisor Marr. Supervisor Christensen.
So a couple of questions, and I don't know whether to go to Supervisor Kim or back to the rent board, but I presume then that there's no limit on the number of apartments in a building that could take advantage of this. In other words, if we have a 10-unit apartment building with 2-bedroom apartments, every one of those 10 units, I would presume, could take advantage of this.
So yes, that is correct. If there are 10 two-bedroom units, the maximum allowable under our own housing, fire, and building code is 4 individuals per 2-bedroom.
I thought I understood it was 2 per bedroom plus 1 per living room. Is that
it is 4 per 2-bedroom.
Okay, so the fire code that allows an additional floating person doesn't apply?
Yes, so actually, thank you for that question. So we base it on the housing, building, and fire code, but whatever is the lesser of the 3 codes.
Got it. Okay, so that's helpful. So if there are 20 people living in a 10-unit building, that could increase to 40 people by this, 2 per bedroom, right? So if I'm living in a 2-bedroom apartment and all my neighbors decide to take in extra people, I land up paying their water bill in a building without metered utilities for each unit. I would land up then paying the water bill not just for me and my roommate, but a percentage of what's now a 40-person building instead of a 20-person building.
Is that a question directed at me, Supervisor?
It would depend on how people's tenancies are set up. Many landlords pay for water and garbage. That's pretty standard in leases in San Francisco. If there is a big increase in the water bills, landlords can file something called an operating and maintenance expense petition with our office, and that's also what would probably happen for the costs attributable to additional occupants, because it's very difficult for us to parse out what costs are attributable to additional occupancy and which are just generic. But the operating and maintenance expense petition is somewhat an odious process. You have to show 2 years' worth of all the aggregate bills for the building. You can't just cherry pick the ones that went up. But there is a mechanism for landlords to petition to pass through the increased costs.
Yeah. Sorry, I just wanted that clarification. So I think it's important to protect our existing housing. And represent a district where I think 95% of our buildings are more than 40 years old. So I certainly appreciate Supervisor Kim's efforts to this. In the laundry incident that she mentioned, which took place in my district, I was able as supervisor to step in and intercede with the landlord and to stop those tenants from being evicted. We even got the abusive property manager fired, but I know we're not on duty all the time, so legislation that codifies some of those protections is welcome. I've also been looking for ways to incentivize and protect our smaller property owners. We have a lot of sort of mom and pop owners in the district, and I've been trying to look for ways that we can protect their interests and not have the speculative landlords come in and the larger management companies and take over more of our buildings. So I appreciate the efforts, especially of Supervisor Wiener and Supervisor Cohen, in making some adjustments to this in order to try to be fairer to our small property owners. I think we need to continue to think of them as we try to protect housing in our city. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Christensen. Supervisor Wiener.
Thank you, Madam President. First, I had misspoken about the exact line numbers that I would like to separate the question on. It's page 8, line 9 through page 9, line 19. So I apologize for misspeaking. Just a couple of points. First of all, Supervisor Cohen, just because I have not made a motion to amend. I just talked about what I had mentioned in committee. So just so we're not talking about a non-existent amendment. A couple things here. First, in terms of the purpose of this legislation, Supervisor Campos had referred to that this is somehow the purpose of the legislation. And I know that since this is now I think perhaps the only disputed part of the legislation, it's tempting to say this is the heart of the legislation. Well, I have followed this legislation very carefully from when Supervisor Kim first announced that she was moving forward with it. And the two things that I've always heard are, one, the vacancy control provision, that if someone doesn't own or move in, you can't raise the rent after you rent it out again. And number two, the gotcha, or minor lease evictions, minor lease violation evictions. Those have always been the two areas that we've heard over and over again, understandably, are the focus of the legislation. Those two, we amended in committee. We made them, I think, even stronger and better than they originally were. And I suspect that if those don't pass unanimously today, it'll be close to unanimous. So what we're talking about now is a very, very discrete part of this legislation. In terms of, I think it's important to be clear, and Supervisor Kim did mention this, but I really want to reiterate it. Yes, landlords continue to have the right to quote-unquote reasonably withhold consent, but it's also important to be clear that that withholding of consent cannot be based on the number of tenants as provided in the lease. It can only be based if you exceed our codes. And so we are effectively eliminating the ability of owners to say, this is too many people living in this building. You can support that, and that's a reasonable point of view, but let's be very clear about what they're doing. It cannot say no, that this is too many people or this exceeds what the lease that you signed requires. I also, a question for Ms. Wolf. You mentioned the possibility of a utility pass-through if there was excessive utility use, and also a rent adjustment if there's an additional roommate. How often do landlords successfully receive those pass-throughs or adjustments?
Utility pass-throughs are actually not that complicated, and a petition doesn't have to, you don't have to have a hearing at our office, you just have to use our formula. So there's many, especially the landlords in the big buildings, use those routinely. The operating and maintenance expense petition, which is what we would be using for the costs attributable to the additional occupant, to be perfectly honest, mostly occur when there's a transfer of the property, because a new owner has new debt service, a new mortgage, a property tax reassessment, so their costs go up way above the annual allowable increase, which must be absorbed first by the owner. For something like this, water, insurance, garbage costs, those things tend to go up, approximating the rate of inflation, and our annual allowable increase is 60% of that. So the amount above that would be somewhat negligible. So most people do not bother to file a petition and have to document 2 years worth of all the expenses on the building for something that would basically be chump change.
And that's, I thank you for that. And my understanding, just in terms of the practice of it, is that it's pretty rare that a landlord will go in based on someone adding a roommate to try to get some sort of adjustment to the rent, because they know that the chances of it actually happening are pretty slim.
Currently, there are no grounds for a rent increase based on an additional occupant. In fact, it's prohibited under our ordinance and state law. This would provide for it, but it doesn't have a mechanism. So we would use our existing mechanism, which is operating and maintenance expenses, and those expenses, as I said, have to be part of the aggregate for all the expenses on the building.
Right. It's not a simple, just check the box kind of process.
Utility pass-throughs are quite simple.
Right. And so I think it's just, again, whatever one's point of view is on this, support or oppose, and it's fine either way. Reasonable minds can differ. I don't think it's a situation where we're going to see significant increases in the number of occupants per unit, and that all of a sudden the landlord's going to go in and get all sorts of pass-throughs. That's just not going to happen. It's not the reality of how this is going to end up working. I'm pretty confident. And so I think, in supporting or opposing it, we shouldn't pretend that it's going to be otherwise. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Supervisor Weiner. Supervisor Tang.
Thank you. I just wanted to add on one additional question. Again, this is regarding the additional occupants. I know Supervisor Kim mentioned that the landlord does have a right of reasonable refusal. Of course, it can't be based on the number of people. She did cite that the overuse of common areas, Ms. Wolf cited that overuse of common areas or whatever is dictated by the rent board could be a reasonable refusal or grounds for that. I'm sorry, Supervisor Kim. But in essence, it's almost based on the number of occupants, because you don't know who's going to be coming in, what those impacts will be. And so I wanted to dive a little bit further about what those reasonable grounds for refusal could possibly be. I don't really see any. This provision will apply to all existing leases. It's not going to start when new leases begin. So depending on whether the landlord decides to screen a tenant or not, I know there's ability and encouragement through this legislation, but I just have trouble believing that a landlord actually has a right of reasonable refusal. I feel like there really is no choice here. And so I wanted to find out from you, Ms. Wolf, what some of those things might be dictated by the rent board.
To be honest, I'm really not sure. We haven't had this legislation come before us yet, and ultimately it would be up to a judge in a court of law if a landlord tried to evict for breach of this and said that they were reasonable in withholding their consent. That would ultimately be up to a judge. But it does say that the fact that the person, usually when people deny a replacement roommate, it's because they're not credit worthy. But this specifically says that if you're not going to be liable for paying the rent, then your credit worthiness is not really relevant.
Right. In fact, I think the legislation says that we cannot check their credit background for the additional occupant.
If that person is not going to be liable.
Right. And so, again, I'm having trouble understanding where that situation may come about, where there is a reasonable ground for refusal of taking on additional tenants. And so I don't know if the sponsor has any response to that as well.
I'm happy to respond as the author of the legislation. I think it may be difficult to ask Ms. Wolf how we designed the legislation, but we specifically, as Ms. Wolf pointed out, there are only two reasons why, two reasons that are not considered a reasonable refusal of a tenant's written request. It may not be based on one of the following. One, as the supervisor mentioned, is the proposed additional occupant's lack of credit worthiness if that person is not going to be legally obligated to pay any or all of the rent to the landlord. If they are, then a credit check can be run. It is only in the case where the new tenant will not be legally obligated to pay for some or all of the rent. The second is the number of occupants allowed by the rental agreement or lease. Those are the only two reasons that are actually outlined as not being a reasonable
a reasonable refusal. We actually give broad discretion both to the rent board and the landlord for a number of reasons that they could reasonably refuse an additional occupant request, and we did that purposefully so.
Supervisor Tang, anything further? Supervisor Campos.
Thank you. Where I do agree with Supervisor Wiener is that I do think that there is a different perspective that people may have on this, and I believe that the exclusion of this protection, it is a pretty significant exclusion, and I think that if this goes forward without that, that we're going to eventually have to come back and address that issue because it will be a problem. I really believe that. But I want to point out a couple of things. First of all, no one has disputed the fact that even with this provision, landlords ultimately have the right to refuse the request of a tenant to add a roommate. Reasonable? I mean, courts have been trying to define the word reasonable for decades. And the reason we have bodies like the rent board is precisely to give them the flexibility and the ability to decide based on the circumstances what is reasonable. And I would trust the rent board before I would trust, quite frankly, any one of us here who is not an expert in these issues in deciding what reasonable is. The reason why that standard of reasonable exists as a matter of law in the common law in our legal system is to give the trier fact and the deciding body the opportunity to look at the specific facts of a circumstance. So that's one thing. The second point is that I think that it is quite remarkable that this board on this issue, when it comes to protecting tenants, is so concerned about the number of people living in a unit, and yet that hasn't been a concern when it comes to the housing situation that's out there when you have landlords that have decided to make a killing on some of these apartment units, where you see some of these apartments being rented for $10,000 a month, $8,000 a month, and the way they can afford it is because they have bunk beds in these bedrooms. I don't see the Board of Supervisors saying anything about the number of people living in those bedrooms then, and yet here we are doing that. And then it's interesting, I mean, it's kind of shocking to hear some of the comments that have been made. You know, God knows how many people are going to be coming into these buildings that we're not going to know. You know, you're not going to know who lives in your building. Where were those arguments around the short-term rental legislation? Where was that concern when people who are now talking about the need to control who's in these buildings refuse to have any kind of limitations on the ability to allow anyone who wants to do short-term rentals whatever they want? It is a very significant point, and it illustrates not just what people think about the specific issue, but it actually tells you a lot about the priorities of this board. And, you know, people may disagree with my position. They may agree with Supervisor Wiener's position, but it's definitely a different view of the world. In my view, it is a mistake, given the imbalance of power that exists between a landlord and a tenant, to tip a scale that's already tipped in favor of the landlord in such a way that we're talking about today. So I think it's a mistake. I think that this provision should be left in this legislation, and I hope that's the outcome that happens today. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Campos. Supervisor Kim.
Thank you. I'll just make some final comments on just this provision of the legislation. It looks like there's broad support for the rest of it, so I thank my colleagues for their support of the legislation. I do agree with Supervisor Wiener. This is a very minor part of this legislation, largely because we were very middle of the road when we articulated this roommate provision. I can't tell you the number of folks that we heard at public comment that were simply trying to add their child, their boyfriend, their girlfriend, a grandmother that actually couldn't afford to live in San Francisco anymore, to move in with them. I mean, often in these roommate provision cases, you're preventing someone from ending up on the streets. And I think that that is really important to note. I think there are very rarely cases where people are taking advantage of a roommate provision just simply for the sake of overcrowding. It's usually, A, because you have a friend or a member of your family that is losing their housing and needs an affordable place to live and not be in our shelter system or in our streets. Or second, it's because the rent is very high and you need to be able to share that cost. So many couples I know are moving in with each other, not because it's the right decision for their relationship, but because it's the right decision for their pocketbook. Why I think this is a reasonable provision, though, is that we are limiting the number of occupants based on what the city has determined is the highest number of occupants that should be in a one-bedroom studio, three-bedroom, etc. We don't place unreasonable numbers of occupants on our own units. So I think that for this board not to support our own code in terms of what is an allowable number of occupants would be unfortunate. The final 2 points that I'll add is that our city is moving towards smaller living spaces per individual. Several years ago, we passed a measure to lower the number of square footage for micro units or efficiency units down to 150 square feet per unit. So we are building smaller and smaller units in the city. So to me, the concern about overcrowding is seems unusual, given that that's the type of housing that the city is building. Developers are building smaller and smaller units. The second issue is short-term rentals. It wasn't an issue for many of us on this board when you put a family on a couch in the living room so that the landlord or tenant can make additional money, rent money off of their unit. But when we talk about a long-term tenant, that will likely be a better neighbor, a better community member because they are there long-term in that community building or apartment, that is suddenly an issue. It wasn't an issue for short-term rentals. We didn't place any types of limits on the number of people that a tenant or landlord could accept on a vacation, on a vacation basis. I don't see why we would do this here and now, especially when we are not setting an arbitrary standard, but one that is based off what the city has determined is reasonable for a unit. So, colleagues, I do ask for your support on the entire legislation that is before us today, and those are my comments.
Okay, seeing no other names on the roster, Madam Clerk, Supervisor Weiner has requested to divide the question. Colleagues, we will take the divided portion first. So on page 8, line 9, page 9, line 19, we will call the roll on that particular item first. Supervisor Farrell.
Thank you. So to be clear, it is the portion that Supervisor Weiner has basically carved out that we'll be voting on first, and the entire underlying item we'll be voting on second.
Yes.
Okay.
Supervisor Farrell?
No.
Farrell, no. Supervisor Kim?
Aye.
Kim, aye. Supervisor Marr?
Aye.
Marr, aye. Supervisor Tang?
No.
Tang, no. Supervisor Weiner?
No.
Weiner, no. Supervisor Yee?
No.
Yee, no. Supervisor Avalos?
Aye.
Avalos, aye. Supervisor Breed?
I'm confused.
Aye.
Breed, aye. Supervisor Campos?
Aye.
Campos, aye. Supervisor Christensen?
Just the occupancy? Yes.
Christensen, aye. Supervisor Cohen?
Aye.
Cohen, aye.
Congratulations.
There are 7 ayes and 4 noes, with
Okay.
Supervisors Farrell, Tang, Weiner, and Yee.
Okay, this item passes and is now folded back into the ordinance. Madam Clerk, can you call the roll on the Supervisor Weiner?
It's not folded back. We're voting on now everything except for that provision.
Okay.
So it's not folded back in. Just clarification.
It's folded back in after this vote.
Okay.
Okay, yes, thank you. Thank you for that clarification,
Both right.
Supervisor Weiner. Madam Clerk, on the item, on the rest of the item, can you please call the roll?
Supervisor Farrell?
Aye.
Farrell, aye. Supervisor Kim?
Aye.
Kim, aye. Supervisor Marr?
Aye.
Marr, aye. Supervisor Tang?
Aye.
Tang, aye. Supervisor Weiner?
Aye.
Weiner, aye. Supervisor Yee?
Aye.
Yee, aye. Supervisor Avalos?
Aye.
Avalos, aye. Supervisor Breed?
Aye.
Breed, aye. Supervisor Campos?
Aye.
Campos, aye. Supervisor Christensen?
Aye.
Christensen, aye. Supervisor Cohen?
Aye.
Cohen, aye. There are 11 ayes.
Okay, this ordinance is passed unanimously on the first reading. Okay, it is past 2:30, and we have two commendations, and we will start with the supervisor from District 5. That would be me. I have a commendation for the Chief of Staff of the San Francisco MTA, Alicia John Baptiste, who is on her way into the room, hopefully. Okay.
Here she is. Okay.
I totally understand. That's fine. Yeah. Yeah. You do right.
Okay. Come on forward. Alicia John Baptiste. You're retiring? No, I'm just kidding. Today, I want to commend the service of Miss Alicia John Baptiste at the San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency. She will be leaving this Friday to join Spur as their new deputy director, so she won't be too far away. In her nearly 3 years at the as the MTA's chief of staff, Alicia made a tremendous contribution to moving the agency forward and achieving the goals laid out in its strategic plan. From the negotiation of labor agreements to jump-starting our culture improvement initiatives, Alicia has played a pivotal role. Importantly, she spearheaded work to get critical funding for the SFMTA, laying the foundation for the $500 million general obligation bond approved by voters last year, and developing plans to institute the transportation sustainability fee that establishes new development fees to fund transportation needs throughout the city. She started off as a special assistant in 1999, where she responded to complaint letters, but quickly was promoted to head of communications for Muni and then became Muni's budget director. She left briefly to work for 8 years at the city's planning department before returning to the SFMTA in 2012. Her time in public service for the city totaled 16 years. Every position that she served in, she did so with a sense of pride, with organizational skills, and she could almost work with anyone, according to her colleagues. And they said a lot of wonderful things about your work. You truly inspired them to do their best work on behalf of the city and county of San Francisco. And it's really great to honor you, because we know that the city doesn't just operate in a bubble. We serve millions of people every single day. And the reason why our city is so great is because of public servants like you, who do a tremendous job, who take pride in their work, and who work hard and roll up their sleeves every single day to make San Francisco a better place for commuters and San Franciscans to get around. So on behalf of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, it is my honor to acknowledge your work and your commitment to the city and county of San Francisco. And we know that you're only a bus ride away. We look forward to your work at Spur, and congratulations on your new position. Supervisor Avalos would like to say a few words as well.
Great. Thank you, President Reed. And just want to say thank you, Alicia, for all of your great work in the city. You really helped to drive our T2030 effort to make sure we can actually invest where we had invested in our transportation system in San Francisco. And I know you were a big part of that effort. And maybe we didn't get everything we wanted to get in terms of looking at revenue sources, but certainly your work helped to really move us forward in a real positive direction where we hadn't had such movement in a very long time in San Francisco, and I think you've left your mark on the city. We'll be able to see it with what we construct in terms of transportation in San Francisco. I also really want to thank you for your work with constituents that my office was working with around our equity framework for the MTA. We were looking at a charter amendment that would try and build in a focus on equity for how the MTA would make decisions around how it invest in new lines or capital programs and services. And you actually made it possible to put that equity framework in focus in place with the MTA board, where we didn't necessarily need the charter amendment. And I just want to thank you for your effort and your work and your listening ability. There were great skills that you showed, and a great example of what fine people that work for the city and county of San Francisco are. So thank you for your service.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Now I'd like to ask Supervisor Kim. I think she has a few words.
I won't say as much because your accomplishments have already been lauded. So I'll just be more personal. I've just really, really enjoyed getting to know you and work with you. I have a tremendous amount of respect for your commitment to public service, our public transit system, and to our city. And I am super sad that you are leaving, especially now that I've gotten to know you better after our trip to Copenhagen to discover the public bikeways that exist there. But I just have to say, it is always amazing to meet public servants that are so committed to the city that really, I think, buck the reputation of the bureaucrat that doesn't care. You're someone that lives here, you're raising your family here. And I think the only thing that gives me some pause to be too sad is that you'll still be continuing to work with us, just in a different capacity at Spur. And so I look forward to that continued relationship, and I just want to thank you so much for all that you've done.
I think Supervisor Wiener wanted to say a few words.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to say thank you for your service as well, and I know Supervisor Kim and President Breed have already spoken. Your work in the planning department at MTA, which are probably the two departments that my office works with the most around every single conceivable kind of land use and transportation issue. And you've been just a real pleasure to work with, and we always know that we can go to you to get answers, to move things forward within the agencies. And also, you've, I think, had sort of trial by fire, whether it's around the TSP or any other number of measures having to come through this board, and you've always been just remarkably zen about it, maybe not inside, but at least externally, and I think you're going to be a huge asset to Spur in terms of bringing that on-the-ground departmental City Hall political experience into the organization. And so best of luck. I look forward to working with you in that capacity.
Thank you.
Now the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, President Breed, supervisors. I am really, truly...
Supervisor Cohen, did you want to... I'm sorry, I didn't see your name. Sorry.
That's okay. I just wanted to say I'm so excited for you. I think the world is your oyster. It's been a joy to work with you. And it is a bittersweet moment to see you leaving us. And it is comforting to know that you will not be far. But you really have done a fantastic job with your department and with your staff. I know when you came in, it was a little bit of a bumpy road, but you've just been a tremendous asset, and it's been really a joy and a privilege to work with you. And your future just seems to be so bright because you're so smart and so talented. I just want you to know that sometimes it's a thankless job, but we thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank
now
you so
really.
Much. Okay, I'm on. Thank you so much, supervisors. I'm so incredibly honored to receive a commendation from you all today. As I've reflected on the 16 years I've spent with the city, I think what's most striking is that I've been able to do work that's been really meaningful, and I'm very grateful to that. But the reality is everything I've done has been in partnership with other people, and that has started with a thoughtful and inspiring leadership that comes from the board and from the 3 various mayors that I've worked for, from the department heads. But really the probably the most impactful thing for me about working in the city has been the hundreds of city staff and community leaders that I've had the opportunity to work with over the years. And I feel as though anything that I've contributed has come back to me 100-fold, and I'm incredibly grateful for that. I did when I thought about, making this final decision to leave the city after 16 years. I started to make a list of everybody I wanted to personally thank. And when I got to about 100, I thought, well, this is not going to be feasible. And I thought you might not appreciate if I read a couple hundred names into the record. So I do want to just use this opportunity to say thank you to all of those people that I've worked with, literally the hundreds of people I've worked with who have shared my dedication and commitment to public service. It's been a joy standing alongside of you, working alongside of you. I will miss it. It's very hard to leave, and I'm just very touched, very grateful for this experience. So thank you very much, and I look forward to being in touch. Thank you.
Congratulations, and we look forward to working with you in your new role. Now I'll call upon the supervisor for District 7, who's going to do the next commendation, Supervisor Yee.
Well, thank you. I'm looking for my staff to come in. So wait, Ms. Scanlon, come on up. Yes, I'm going to do this.
I think you're being asked to come up.
Thank you for your patience here.
Lots of surprises at the Board of Supervisors.
Okay, this is a proclamation that I'm presenting that's going to be really a bittersweet proclamation. This is going to be special for me and my staff. Many people do not realize how difficult it is to work as a public servant, and especially for a legislator or elected official. But today we have a special accommodation for someone who I've gotten the pleasure to work with over the last 3 years. This person has served the city for nearly 13 years at the same office and in the same capacity. This week, we will be celebrating the work of a good friend and colleague, Olivia Scanlon, who will be transitioning from my office at the Board of Supervisors for a new opportunity at the San Francisco Fire Department. Olivia joined the District 7 office, can you believe this or not? It's not 2013, but 2003, and have served not only one, but three supervisors of District 7. And of course, I'm her favorite. And, most of the legislative aides for supervisors don't last more than go through one cycle of supervisors, and yet she's on her third. And maybe it's time for her to do something different that can provide some growth for her. But Olivia originally hails from Ireland. If you speak to her, that's pretty obvious. And was a special event planner at the prestigious Olympic Club for many years before she was hired to work at City Hall. For over a decade, she has been a rock in our office, solving constituents' issues, from fixing streets to helping to create a brand new open space in the district that we'll be celebrating this Thursday. Her wit and humor bring much joy to our office and to the work she does in the community. She is a loving mother of 3 children, young children, who absolutely adore her and, of course, the Lego set that we have in our office. Not only is she a tireless aide, but someone that cares deeply about the greater community. She is often seen volunteering at the Irish Center and at her children's school. While Olivia will not be going far and will stay within the city family, she will be sorely missed in our office and in our district. As a token of our utmost appreciation for her service and for her setting the bar as the longest-serving aide at the Board of Supervisors, we would like to offer her a special accommodation in the form of a proclamation. Today, we will honor Olivia Scanlon as Olivia Scanlon Day for her selfless public services and tireless dedication of the citizens of District 7 of San Francisco. Today, we will now be known as Olivia Scanlon Day in San Francisco. So, Olivia, we will surely miss you and expect to transfer many constituent calls, even though you're not working for my office, to you anyways. So, I want to say that congratulations to your special day.
Supervisor Tang.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Supervisor Yee, for your words. And Olivia, I'm so sad to see you go. I have known you for a large portion of the time that you've been here at City Hall, and we've been through a lot together. I remember I first met you because you were very good friends with my former colleague, Cammie Blackstone, and she said that every time she talked to you, she couldn't concentrate on what you're saying because of your beautiful Irish accent. And so I'm really going to miss that, but mostly I'm going to miss the breath of fresh air that you bring to City Hall. Whether it was your perspective on how to deal with difficult constituents in our neighborhoods, which some of us have to share, or it was, policy matters. I just really appreciated your perspective on things, taking everything into consideration. So I'm going to miss you dearly, but I really hope that you'll have a wonderful journey ahead and in your new department. So thank you for everything you've done for not only District 7, but for San Francisco.
Thank you, Supervisor Tang. Supervisor Farrell.
Thank you, President Breed. Boy, Olivia, I can't believe the day has come. I just want to take the time publicly to say thank you for everything you've done for me and for my staff. When we first came in office about a little over 4.5 years ago, it was you and Sean and Carmen and Katie that really provided a lot of guidance in terms of how City Hall worked, and you whipped us into shape pretty quick. But just please know how much we all appreciate it. You've become a great friend. Obviously, a stalwart in the Irish community, and I know you'll continue to do all of that work. That's simply who you are, and I just have admired so much how you balance all the work and the kids and everything that goes on with that. I know it's job one, but congrats. Norman's losing an amazing aide. We're all losing an amazing friend around here, but as everyone said, I think you're going to do awesome. It's a great opportunity, and look forward to being in touch, but thanks so much for everything.
Thank you, Supervisor Farrell. Supervisor Cohen.
Thank you, Olivia. I too want to associate myself with the comments of my previous colleagues. It's been a pleasure to work with you and also to watch you grow. You've been a consummate professional, and you've been a lady, even under pressure. You've been graceful and very respectful, and even when there were times when you found yourself in disagreeable situations, you've always maintained a classy attitude. And you've also been not only a role model for the legislative aides, but also members on the Board of Supervisors. Watching you balance your career as well as motherhood has just been very inspiring. And so I'm looking forward to watching your career further as you go on to other things. Thank you.
Thank you. Supervisor Avalos.
Thank you. Olivia, there's probably two other people who work in this room longer than me on the Board of Supervisors. That's you and our clerk of the work, Angela Calvillo. You've been the longest person serving as a legislative aide. I was a former legislative aide working with you. And I just, it's been a real pleasure all these years to work with you. And you've been a really straightforward person to work with and a lot of fun at times. And just want to say thank you for your service and look forward to seeing what more you give to the city and county of San Francisco. And it'll be different not having you here on the Board of Supervisors.
So now you're going to hear the voice that confused me when I went to Ireland, when I thought every female in Ireland was Olivia.
Thank you very much. So I had no idea that this was happening, so I'm shocked. But it's a bittersweet moment for me today because I came in here, I was just newly married, I had no children, and now I walk out of here with 3 beautiful children and made so many good friends. I've learned so much in City Hall as an aide, and the one thing that I'll take away from here is never think you know everything, because the day that you think you know everything is the day that you stop growing. My time here has had ups and downs, but it's always been a fun time in City Hall. And when we say city family, it really is a city family. You know, we have our ups and downs, we have our disagreements, but for me, you know, I just had to enjoy my job every day and look on the bright side. And I said to my colleagues when I started working with them 3 years ago for Supervisor Yee, I always use in my head honey over vinegar. When I have a constituent that was screaming at me, I'd always think, you know, it's nicer to be nice to them, because if you're nice to them, they can't be nasty back to you. So honey over vinegar is the thing that I always live by. It's try to be nice regardless of what comes back at you. But I'd like to thank everybody on the Board of Supervisors, especially Supervisor Yee, my current boss, and Supervisor Elsburn, who is like brother to me, and I just see him there, and he's, you know, myself and Sean, we definitely fight like brother and sister. And we had an amazing 9 years together, and now it all comes to an end, and I move on to something new and exciting, and something that I hope I can make a difference in. I'm hoping that I still work with you all, and I really appreciate this honor, and I appreciate everybody that I've worked with for the past 12 years. Thank you.
Congratulations, Olivia. You will be missed around City Hall, but I know you won't be too far away. Thank you. Before we return to our agenda, I'd just like to wish Reverend Cecil Williams, who's joining us today, a happy 86th birthday.
Congratulations.
Reverend Williams has a rich history in this city, fighting for civil rights, taking care of those in need, not only in the Tenderloin, but all over our city. You are truly a jewel in this city, and we are so grateful for your lifetime of service to the city and county of San Francisco. Happy birthday. And thank you for joining us today. Now I'd like to return to our regular agenda. Madam Clerk, please go to item number 12.
Item 12 is a motion to confirm the mayor's appointment of Leah Pimentel to the Successor Agency Commission for a term ending November 3rd, 2016.
Supervisor Campos?
Thank you very much, Madam President. Let me say that, this is not something that I do lightly. This is actually an individual that I have supported in a different capacity before. But in light of comments that I have gotten from members of my community, especially in the Mission community, about the lack of responsiveness or consideration for the concerns of that community, I will be voting no on this appointment today. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Campos. Supervisor Weiner.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam President. I'll be supporting Ms. Pimentel's nomination. I've had the pleasure of working with Ms. Pimentel in various capacities inside and outside of City Hall, and I've always found her to be a very thoughtful and committed person. I think she'll be a great addition to this commission, and so I will be voting yes.
Thank you. Supervisor Christensen.
I'd just like to second that. I've known Ms. Pimentel for quite some time, and I regret any difficulties Mr. Campos's associates have experienced, but I have always found her to be intelligent and energetic and responsive, and so I'm delighted to support her appointment.
Thank you. Supervisor Cohen.
Thank you. I, too, am going to be supporting the appointment of Leah Pimentel, who is a thoughtful and courageous woman who has accepted the call for public service. This is a woman who who stepped up into a leadership role when there was no title, when there was no recognition needed. She saw, and she continues to see, a job that needs to be done. I also want to point out that we are in a city that has a diminishing African American population, and I think it is incumbent upon us to be consistent with our words and our actions and continue to support talent, particularly calling out talent in the African American community. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Cohen. Madam Clerk, can you please call the roll?
On item 12, Supervisor Farrell.
Aye.
Farrell, aye. Supervisor Kim. Kim, aye. Supervisor Marr.
Aye.
Marr, aye. Supervisor Tang.
Aye.
Tang, aye. Supervisor Weiner.
Aye.
Weiner, aye. Supervisor Yee.
Aye.
Yee, aye. Supervisor Avalos.
Aye.
Avalos, aye. Supervisor Breed.
Aye.
Breed, aye. Supervisor Campos.
No.
Campos, no. Supervisor Christensen.
Aye.
Christensen, aye. Supervisor Cohen.
Yes.
Cohen, aye. There are 10 ayes, 1 no, with Supervisor Campos in the dissent.
Okay, the motion is approved. Madam Clerk, item 13.
Item 13 is a motion to appoint Supervisor Jane Kim, term ending June 1st, 2016, to the Reentry Council.
Okay, can I have a motion to excuse Supervisor Kim? Motioned by Supervisor Yee, seconded by Supervisor Avalos. Without objection, Supervisor Kim is excused. Roll call vote, Madam Clerk.
On item 13, Supervisor Farrell.
Aye.
Farrell, aye. Supervisor Marr.
Aye.
Marr, aye. Supervisor Tang.
Aye.
Tang, aye. Supervisor Weiner.
Aye.
Weiner, aye. Supervisor Yee.
Aye.
Yee, aye. Supervisor Avalos.
Aye.
Avalos, aye. Supervisor Breed.
Aye.
Breed, aye. Supervisor Campos.
Aye.
Campos, aye. Supervisor Christensen.
Aye.
Christensen, aye. Supervisor Cohen. Cohen, aye. There are 10 ayes.
This motion is approved unanimously. Madam Clerk, let's go to the committee reports at this time.
Items 14 and 15 were considered by the Public Safety and Neighborhood Services Committee at a regular meeting on Thursday, September 17th, and were both forwarded as committee reports. Item 14 is a resolution to urge the city to establish a memorial for comfort women.
Supervisor Marr.
Thank you, President Breed. I feel tremendous pride in these chambers today as a Chinese American, but a member of the Asian and Pacific Islander communities. I have strong faith that the chambers here and San Francisco values of unity and justice will prevail today as we vote on this resolution and enact a memorial. I wanted to also say that the last few weeks and the very emotional hearings, like on Thursday at the Public Safety and Neighborhood Services Committee, have given me faith and hope that people will come together because of a better future that we want for our children. I think of my 15-year-old daughter who's of Chinese and Japanese American heritage, and I want her to learn a lot from Grandma Lee and so many others that are here in these chambers with us as well. I think themes that popped out for me from our board meeting last week to the hearings, speaking truth to power is one critical lesson that I've learned from Grandma Lee and so many others that are joining us. Breaking silence over generations and over decades is what we're talking about here today. And lessons for me as a parent as well, of a fiercely independent young daughter who's learning about life. There's so much in this teaching moment before us as a city that we are learning together. I also wanted to say that San Francisco is a place of the founding of the United Nations. We have memorials not only to the Holocaust, but the 100-year-old Armenian genocide on Mount Davidson, peace pagodas donated by the people of Osaka, to many other memorials that are on public park space. And my hope is that as we develop a memorial for the over 200,000 girls and women and the current 2.09 million people that are human trafficked every day throughout the world, that this memorial will fit in very nicely with our values as San Franciscans. I wanted to shift the power of the room for a moment and say that the 11 members of the Board of Supervisors and our president often hold all the power in the room. But to me, power is emanating from many of you that are here, but especially from Grandma Lee, Halmani Lee, who has come to us from Seoul with a tremendous gift of peace and love and healing and justice. I wanted to say that her strength of refusing to be a victim is something that I will never forget. Her strength of standing up to people that are the denialists that deny history. She is living history, a living testament of suffering, but also of healing and about justice as well. She's about future generations and our future. Healing comes not easily often, and my hope is that we are not looking at healing with Band-Aids and false words, but real healing that's bringing together communities with empathy and compassion for justice. It's a shared sense of justice that many of us feel in our hearts, but deep listening is critical. Grandma Lee's power is transformational. It's beautiful. She and the women's movements of Korea and Japan and Asia and in the U.S. are transforming all of us today in these chambers and will for future generations and for future memorials that will spread throughout this country and the world. I think it's important that we listen to her, and not just kind of a fake, shallow listening, but really deep listening, and listening to other victims of oppression as the true tellers of what history is about. We're being transformed in these chambers to be more human, as Grace Lee Boggs from Detroit says. We're being transformed to be more empathetic to people suffering and the forced sexual slavery of over 200,000 girls and women. We're being transformed to really deeply think about empathy and compassion for the current day victims of human trafficking, or as Pope Francis calls, global slavery. I wanted to thank the coalition, the Comfort Women Justice Coalition, for teaching me so much about what it is to be an elected official. I wanted also to say that I also, as a 16-year teacher of Asian American Studies and Ethnic Studies at San Francisco State, often go to my long-time held mentors and resources. One poem that I would like to say our poet laureate, Janice Mirikotani, is with us in the room, and thank you to Cecil Williams from Glide Church for being here, civil rights leaders for our communities. But one poem, I think, gets at the heart of what the Comfort Women Justice Coalition has done over the past several months to build a broad Pan-Asian women's and faith-based and civil rights leadership in the coalition. But the poem is called Firepot, from a book called Time Degrees, from third world poets, people of color poets within our communities, with an intro by Maya Angelou. But I wanted to read Firepot by Janice Mirikotani. Different shores, language torn, relocated, immigrated, unassimilated, Asian. We share a common struggle against those who would attempt to split our tongues, chalk our minds, the common need to maintain who we are, to understand each other through, though we speak in different dialects and languages, though we are born from different roots. Korea, Japan, China, Samoa, Philippines, Southeast Asia, we must experience our connections. Japanese American, Chinese American, Korean American, Filipino American, FOB, ABC. We have been fractured, made to look at each other as though we are divided. But if we see with clear eyes, we know we are bound by common shackles. Manila to Vietnam, Korea to Laos, China to the islands, Hiroshima to Cambodia, Post Street to Hunters Point, Kearny Street to the Richmond, Mission to the Valley. Bound by our survival, bound by our strengths. Firepot, a collective soup of many tastes and ingredients. We come together from our own cultures, races. Add in this book our individual flavors and seasonings, Firepot. The brothers and sisters in this section are only a sampling of our different flavors. They speak for themselves, sing their own rhythms, understand the meaning of the soul, beauty, pain beneath our yellow-brown skin. Rice, adobo, sashimi, imu, juk, gailan, kimchi, chicken feet, a pickled sea, choy-sum, and mango trees nourish us. Hear it, smell it, feel it, taste it. Time degrees, and that means feast. Thank you to Janice Mirikitani, our poet laureate, for the spirit of bringing us together. Colleagues, join me in passing this resolution unanimously. Stand with the Justice for Comfort Women Coalition and so many others that are here with us today to develop a memorial in San Francisco and send a clear message from our beautiful city of San Francisco, a clear message of justice, of compassion, and of unity in declaring never again will we allow atrocities to occur and for governments and institutions to try to silence women and girls and movements for justice and healing. Thank you to Supervisor Jane Kim, Malia Cohen, Julie Christensen, Norman Yee, Mark Farrell, David Campos, and John Avalos for being the co-sponsors of this resolution. I think it's important that we're doing our best to be inclusive and to educate our communities about stopping global human trafficking of women and girls today as well. The resolution was heard on Thursday afternoon at Public Safety and Neighborhood Services Committee, and thank you to my colleagues Julie Christensen and David Campos for moving it forward with a unanimous support. We were moved to hear Grandma Yang-Soo Lee's personal story and testimony, as well as nearly 4 hours of public comment from numerous organizations and individuals. Grandma Lee and the members of the Comfort Women Justice Coalition and leaders from the Asian Pacific American community have worked relentlessly to raise awareness of the women who suffered during World War II, forced into sexual slavery by the Japanese Imperial Armed Forces as comfort women. But the resolution also supports a memorial for the so-called comfort women, but also is a first step towards education and community programs that will make sure we never forget as a city. The memorial will provide a sacred place for remembrance, reflection, and atonement for over 200,000 women and young girls, euphemistically referred to as quote-unquote comfort women, who were kidnapped and forced into sexual slavery by the Imperial Japanese Armed Forces during its occupation of Asia and the Pacific Islands from the 1930s through the duration of World War II. For the past several years, my office has made compassionate, informed, and sincere efforts to work closely with the Comfort Women Justice Coalition, with the Mayor's Office, but also with women's civil rights, faith-based, and community leaders from Korean American, Chinese American, Filipino American, and Japanese American communities to craft this resolution in the spirit of unity and moving our city forward. This afternoon, we're also honored again to have Halmini Lee, Grandma Yang-Soo Lee, with us. She's graced San Francisco with her heart and strength. She's an example of living history of sorrow turned into empowerment, healing, and justice. Her courage, bravery, and leadership are something that I will never forget. She speaks against not only the atrocities of World War II Japanese Imperial Armed Forces, coercing and forcing young women like herself into sexual slavery as comfort women, but she also speaks about the future, that we can heal and we can come together as well. Thank you for fighting for justice and dignity for people. I can't thank everyone from the coalition, but I did want to single out Victor Lim for my staff for amazing work in helping the coalition and moving the legislation forward. Raquel Redondias as well for my staff. Our policy interns, Lindsay Kimple, who's done tremendous work. And during the summer, Annika Stagg from the London School of Economics and Angela Yip from UCLA's Asian American Studies Department for their work with the coalition. Colleagues, I have several minor amendments that you all have at your chairs that emphasize human trafficking from Not for Sale and a number of human trafficking groups in our San Francisco task force. It also acknowledges the Japanese American community's shared experience of discrimination with other Asian and Pacific Islander communities and the horrors of the Japanese 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, the vast majority of them U.S. citizens, 2/3 of them who are incarcerated in U.S. concentration camps as well, so it adds language on that. And I wanted to also say that it emphasizes that the memorial as we move forward will be a public memorial in a very public place so that everyone can benefit from the healing and the learning from our memorial for comfort women. I wanted to say that I'm appreciative of the work of Supervisors Norman Yee and Scott Wiener to also bring about another language change, which I'll be supporting as well. The next steps after this resolution passes, the hard work begins after it passes, believe it or not. I'm working with city officials, including the mayor's office and others, to establish a working group that will join the coalition, the Comfort Women Justice Coalition and other city officials in designing and implementing the memorial within a year. I'm also working with Asian and Pacific Islander organizations, faith-based and university leaders to coordinate teach-in type community building events, similar to the Day of Remembrance programs that we have organized in the Japanese American communities around February 19th, the anniversary of the executive order that sent 120,000 people into camps, or the December 13th annual Days of Remembrance that the Rape of Nanjing Redress Coalition organizes, or the Armenian Genocide annual days in April as well. But it's about Days of Remembrance to build off of a memorial, but also with the school district and city departments on curriculum and other materials that could make sure that the spirit of Harmony Lee and so many others are never forgotten, and that we build for the future of peace and justice for everyone. We're making history in San Francisco today, not just because of Harmony Lee's presence, but I did want to say that in her comments on Thursday and before the board, she said, "We hate the crimes that were done to us, but we do not hate the people." She also said that despite denialists and right-wing and ultra-nationalists in Japan trying to squelch and silence history, that no matter what they try to do, the truth will come out no matter what. And it's because of the coalition and Harmony Lee and so many others, Phyllis Kim from the Korean American Forum from LA, the Nikkei for Civil Rights and Redress, formerly the National Coalition for Redress and Reparation, so many others that will ensure that history will come out. I wanted to thank the Korean Chamber of Commerce as well, the Korean Senior Services Center for their amazing work, the Korean American Forum, also the Korean American community leaders that have come out in support of the resolution and the memorial, the Chinese 6 companies, to President Ma and others. Thank you so much to our regional Chinese associations, over 100 organizations supporting this effort, the Chinese American Association of Commerce, Julie Su, the Commissioner on the Commission on the Status of Women, and Marilee Mandahar from the Filipino Women's Network, Gabriela USA, and Asian Americans for Peace and Justice, tremendous organizations building our coalition. Thank you to our public defender, Jeff Adachi, who's been with us from day one as well and expresses his solidarity and support. I wanted to also thank, besides Judges Lillian Singh and Julie Tang from the Rape of Nanjing Redress Coalition, and really the heart of the Comfort Women Justice Coalition, but also new leaders like Miho Kim Lee from the Japan-U.S. Feminist Network for Decolonization and many others that are building our coalition as well. Lastly, we're making history here in San Francisco, and I wanted to thank my co-sponsors. We are breaking the silence for a future of healing and justice for generations to come. Harmony Lee, Grandma Lee, thank you. Thank you so much for being here. Colleagues, I'd just like to know if any others have comments, and I've introduced my amendments before us and urge unanimous support for those amendments. Thank you.
So Supervisor Marr has made a motion to amend the legislation. Is there a second? Seconded by Supervisor Kim. Okay, Supervisor Kim.
Thank you, and I just want to thank Supervisor Marr and his office for their leadership around this work. I think when it was introduced, it was largely viewed as something that would pass fairly easily and unanimously on this board. But of course, with any major event and atrocity that is committed, there is, of course, a lot of debate and discussion that, that people want to continue to have. I'll just say a couple of things about why this resolution is so important to me personally. I had mentioned when we recognized Harmony Lee last week that I grew up hearing stories about young Korean girls who are kidnapped and abducted from their homes and taken to serve as sex slaves for the Japanese military for years. Later, as a young adult, I read many of the stories written by these comfort women who were raped 20, 30, 40 times a day, over and over again, humiliated, scared, frightened, and incredibly young to serve warfare. You know, later I went to see the museums where many of these stories were exhibited, and then finally had the opportunity to hear from the women themselves about these stories. It is terribly hard to listen to. It is terribly hard to believe that this can happen to anyone in this world. And I think what is so important about recognizing these stories today is that violence against women continue. They still continue to this day in this country and throughout the world. And so it is incumbent on us to really recognize these brave women that have told these stories. They are so, so hard to tell. And even in our chambers, I think we've seen the small example of that, of seeing women still accused of lying and saying that it wasn't that bad or it didn't really happen to them. And so, you know, I just want to, again, thank the leadership for continuing to keep these stories alive. And I also want to recognize, I think, some of the concerns that were said. This is one atrocious example of human trafficking and violence against women, and it is certainly not limited to Japan, but it does not erase what the Japanese government and military did. But to say that this is a reflective of an entire people is definitely wrong. And as someone who later read the Barefoot Gen novels of the 6-year-old boy who grew up in Hiroshima and watched his whole family die in front of his eyes and melt away, there has been excruciating experiences on all sides during war, and we must recognize that. But we must also recognize this story as well. And finally, I just want to really thank Harmony Lee for telling your story and making sure that we don't forget. And I had said this last week, but it is simply revolutionary in itself that you have survived and that you have decided to dedicate your life to telling this story so it doesn't happen to young women again. Harmony Lee, 이야기 우리한테 얘기했으니까요. 많이 감사합니다. 당신의 힘을 주셔서 많이 감사합니다. 저도 사랑 많이 했습니다. So colleagues, I look forward to your support. At roll call today, I'm actually introducing a legislation to start a task force to help young women on college campuses come out and report rape and sexual assault. And this is really in many ways inspired by Grandma Lee and doing this globally, we must end violence against women in our city as well. And so thank you again for your courage and leadership and inspiring us to do so much more.
Thank you. Supervisor Wiener.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you to everyone on all sides of this resolution for having the passion to be involved in what we all recognize was just a terrible, terrible chapter in human history. I want to thank Grandma Lee for having the courage and the strength to come to San Francisco, and welcome to San Francisco, and the strength and the courage to travel to a lot of places and to tell your story over and over and over and over again. And I, as someone who cannot even imagine what it was like to go through what you went through, the strength that it takes to keep recounting that story, not a story, but that truth, what happened to you, I cannot even begin to fathom the courage that it takes to do that. And so welcome to San Francisco, and thank you for your courage and your leadership. It is critically important that we remember and that we memorialize and that we learn from what happened to the comfort women. And I hate using that phrase because it really is a euphemism, but I know that that's the phrase that has been used. And it's so important that we remember and that we teach and that we learn so that we don't forget and so that it never happens again. And I think we have absolute and complete and utter unity around that in this building, and I'm sure throughout the city. And that's why it is, this process has been particularly painful, because we've seen a divide within our Asian Pacific American community, that very broad community, among leaders in areas of civil rights and social and economic justice, leaders in the fight to end human trafficking and to make sure that women are treated fairly and equally and as full members of our community. It has been painful to see incredible leaders, people who I've considered friends for many, many years, be at odds on this issue, particularly when at its core everyone agrees about the horror of what happened before and during World War II to these many women. So I, as I think everyone in this room knows, a week or two ago, sat down at the computer myself and decided, let's see if we can de-escalate this situation and bring these otherwise allies, these strong allies, mostly Asian American women ally leaders, together and de-escalate the situation and rally around the need to memorialize and remember what happened to the comfort women. The amendments, frankly, I think have been fairly distorted and mischaracterized in some quarters, which is unfortunate. The amendments did not remove a single word from Supervisor Marr's resolution. Not one word was deleted. The resolution continued to contain a clear and unequivocal endorsement of the Comfort Women Memorial. What the amendments did was to include a few additional items. First of all, to acknowledge and embrace the contributions of our Japanese American community, to acknowledge that our Japanese American community was placed in the concentration camps here in the Western United States during World War II. And also to acknowledge the broader context of human trafficking and abuse and victimization of women. To acknowledge that what the Japanese Imperial Army did was horrific and inexcusable and unforgivable, but that very, very sadly, this did not happen in a vacuum. That this has been the story of women in this world from the beginning of time, example after example after example of countries across cultures and across the world victimizing and abusing and at times enslaving women. And that was the point of the amendments. And I know that some kept saying that this is watering it down. It didn't water anything down. It placed this horrible incident in context and then said we should have a memorial specific to comfort women so that we learn and never forget. And some said to me, various people said, well, Scott, as a Jew, what would you say if there were a resolution to establish a Holocaust memorial and someone tried to insert language around other genocides? And that was a really interesting question, because the answer is, colleagues, you've heard me talk about the Holocaust before, where 6 million members of my community were placed into ovens and were killed in ovens because they were Jewish. And when we in the Jewish community talk about the Holocaust, and we have Holocaust memorials here, a small one here in Washington, in Jerusalem, in other places that are specific to the Holocaust, just like this memorial will be specific to the comfort women. But when we talk about the Holocaust, we place it in the broader context. We don't run away from the fact that there was a Holocaust, that there was a genocide in Rwanda or in Cambodia or in Armenia. We embrace the fact that the Holocaust, as unique as it was, is also part of a broader context of human history where people at times massacre other groups of people for who they are. And that doesn't in any way water down our remembrance and our memorialization of the Holocaust so that it never happens again, but it strengthens it. It strengthens it because we are saying that it can so easily happen again because it has happened again repeatedly between the end of the Holocaust and today in Cambodia, in Rwanda, and in other places. And it's imperative that we do not look at these things in a vacuum and that we always remember the broader context. And so those amendments were intended in that spirit. I think they were in that spirit. And here we are today. I want to thank Supervisor Marr for his amendments, which incorporated some of our discussion, particularly around the contributions and the discrimination against the Japanese American community. I also, Supervisor Yi and I have worked on a modified amendment in terms of recognizing that this did not happen in a vacuum and that there are other countries that have abused women. And I've distributed that amendment. And I want to make one change to what I distributed. Instead of saying excuse Japan's actions, it would say excuse the actions of the Japanese Imperial Army. So it would read, whereas victimization of women has occurred in other countries, however, it does not in any way excuse the actions of the Japanese Imperial Army. And so that is a motion to amend. And I think it would go, the page and line numbering has changed. It would go after the whereas clause that talks about the other cities that have established memorials. And so I'll make that motion.
Okay, Supervisor Wiener has made a motion to amend. Is there a second? Seconded by Supervisor Yi. Supervisor Yi.
Thank you very much, President Bree, and thank you, Supervisor Wiener, for introducing the amendment. First of all, I really wanted to thank Supervisor Marr for bringing this up, and when he first brought this up and gave us notice about this, I jumped right at it and said, yeah, I want to co-sponsor. This is really important for myself. I grew up with these stories also, and didn't realize as a kid what my parents were talking about, but later when I read about it, I realized it. And I want to thank the coalition. I want to thank the coalition members for working on this and making it a reality. Thank you, Grandma Lee, for being here from Korea and really being the person that we could identify and say, yes, this is a real story, we know it, and you just made it even more real. It's important to remember our history, whether it's good or bad, and sometimes we shy away from that and forget about things. And we really need to learn from our past to continue to rise up against any evil acts that come along. The amendment that I'm supporting allows us to continue to focus on the issue of the comfort woman, but I think to make this resolution even stronger, it gives us an opportunity to remember what happened, but it also gives us an opportunity to address anything that comes in the future. It's basically saying, let's build a springboard from this. Let's just don't stop caring about one thing. Let's care about this and care about other issues that come up as we know will come up, and that we will not be afraid to say stop it because we see what happened from the past. And if it's not us that's going to say stop, who's going to say it? So I just want to, again, keep this real short. I fully am looking forward to having a memorial be placed in our public grounds.
Supervisor Tang.
Thank you. I'm just going to keep my comments real short as well because I know there's been a lot of dialogue about this, but just seeing everyone here, everyone who's been involved in the conversation leading up to this resolution today, I just really hope that we can all harness this energy to do good in this community, to make sure that nothing like this ever happens again, that we can all collectively address issues to eliminate domestic violence against women, eliminate human trafficking in this world. So I want to thank you all for being here, and I hope that we can move on from this being more productive in our community. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Supervisor Tang. Supervisor Christensen.
I'll try to be brief as well. I said in committee that I think it's very important that we recognize and remember and condemn despicable acts whenever they've occurred. 70 years is a long time to wait for recognizing and remembering and condemning this despicable act. I'm grateful to Grandma Lee for coming to inspire us, to those who have worked hard to come to this day, and to my colleague Supervisor Marr and those who have participated in this. I hope it's noted by the community that our deliberations have not been about whether such a monument should exist, but rather how it should be framed. And I have people I respect who have seen this issue on different sides. I echo the concern. It's painful to see people I respect disagreeing with each other, especially when it's women disagreeing with women about an issue that I think we all find reprehensible. So I'm grateful to Supervisor Wiener, Supervisor Yee, and especially to Supervisor Marr for considering a little of the healing balm in the language that will make sure that we, in trying to properly memorialize one group of people, do not unfairly malign another group. So I'm grateful for that effort, and that has been, I think, the focus of our deliberations. And so I'm appreciative to all. It's certainly been a cathartic experience to go through all of the testimony and the thought on this, and I'm happy to see us move forward and to begin talking about the form that this memorial may take.
President Breed.
Thank you. Supervisor Marr, through the chair, I had a question regarding the word public in your amendments. More specifically, your use of that word is vague, and I just wanted to understand exactly what that implies.
Supervisor Marr?
Thank you. I just wanted to say that there have been some threats from some individuals in San Francisco that they would not let a memorial on public land. So that's everything from Golden Gate Park to Lincoln Park to even Japantown, where there's a number of memorials from the Peace Pagoda to the California Japantown Landmarks Project monument, bronze monument that depicts Japanese-American experience. So it's really an effort to ensure that the most accessible place would be chosen, likely on parks land, like many of our hundreds of memorials and plaques and statues are in San Francisco.
Which would also include a separate public process to make it possible.
Yeah, the private funds that have been raised for this memorial, like others from the Armenian genocide to other memorials, really is an outpouring of the support from the Comfort Women Justice Coalition, and well over, I think it's $140,000 has been raised. My work with city departments, from the Arts Commission to the Rec and Park Department, along with a task force, will be about what's the most appropriate design and locations for the potential memorial. So it's to really ensure that it's going to be a public space that is accessible to people.
President Breed?
Okay. I guess my only concern about including public is it limits it to only a public space rather than any space that could exist for the possibility of having this. So, and then also I just want to make sure that there's not some expectation that somehow we're obligated to fund this without the appropriate process in place.
No, I think the coalition's already been meeting with Denny Kern and Phil Ginsburg with Rec and Park, the mayor's office, and many other departments. And my conversations with Tom DeCaney, the head of the Arts Commission, and others, that we would be working through the city family, the city departments, and the mayor's office to ensure that it's a process that moves forward, that many people can be involved in. The Comfort Women Justice Coalition has reached out to many in the Japanese American community, so there's lots of involvement already. We want this to be an inclusive process too, but the use of the term public is because of some threats from a couple individuals that public land was off limits, but it's to acknowledge that we want an accessible place that the task force and all the departments can agree on.
Thank you. I just want to make a couple of comments as the supervisor who represents Japantown. During World War II, as we know, many Japanese Americans were taken to internment camps, and during that time, specifically in the Western Addition community, which had a population, a large population of both African American and Japanese Americans, we lived together in the community, we grew up together in the community, and so when our Japanese brothers and sisters were taken from the community, many of our families moved into their homes, and there's a lot of documentation about the relationship that exists. So after World War II was over and many Japanese returned to the Western Addition community, you know, African Americans opened the doors. There was actually a play at ACT that basically paid tribute to that relationship that has existed over many generations. There were terrible crimes that were committed during World War II, as we all know, in Europe and in Asia, and yes, in America too. There are victims who deserve our respect and lessons we must never forget. We have a moral obligation to remember. But commemorating the past should be about healing wounds and not reopening them. Today, I hope that we can move in that direction. I know this debate has been very painful for so many people. Last week, committee meeting, I watched it on video, and honestly, it was really hard for me to watch. It was very emotional, and it was just really difficult to just process all of the emotion that existed as a result of the hearing. 70 years after the end of World War II, clearly we are still trying to heal. As a community, as a city, we must come together. We have to find unity. I am proud to represent a district that includes Japantown, as well as a large population of Korean and Chinese Americans. We can build a Comfort Women Memorial to Korean and Chinese victims without it being an attack on Japanese Americans, just as we have built Holocaust museums that are not an attack on German Americans. Commemoration is not about blame, it's about respect. I want to see us build a memorial that respects the Comfort Women victims and brings our communities together, and I hope, Supervisor Marr, you will take the lead in trying to to process and allow our communities to work together and heal. I think the amendments that are proposed today really reinforce that tone, and now the responsibility is on us all to carry this forward. The Greek physician Hippocrates said, healing is a matter of time, but it sometimes also is a matter of opportunity. 7 decades after the last shot was fired, let's please take this opportunity to come together and heal those wounds. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, President Breed. Colleagues, any other comments? Actually.
Supervisor Marr.
Thank you, President Breed and colleagues. I just wanted to thank you for listening to Grandma Lee, the coalition that's growing, and it has been emerging from the Korean American, Chinese, Filipino, Japanese American, women's, faith-based, and civil rights communities. Thank you so much for listening. Grandma Lee, you've changed San Francisco as we move forward to pass this resolution and commit ourselves to establishing a memorial. Though it may not mention you in it, I'll just say your heart and your strength and courage will forever be in San Francisco. Thank you so much, colleagues, and I urge a unanimous vote on this resolution.
Supervisor Campos.
Thank you, President Breed, and thank you to Supervisor Marr for your leadership. Thank you to your staff, Victor Lim, for working on this, to Supervisor Yee, Supervisor Wiener. I don't want to repeat everything that's been said. I just want to say it on a very personal level. I want to thank Grandma Lee for coming to San Francisco. You have given the city and county of San Francisco a great gift. It's the gift of truth, and it's a gift that will keep on giving. And I am grateful that for years to come, so many generations of San Franciscans will learn about what happened here, and that is in great part because of the courage of Grandma Lee. Thank you on behalf of certainly the district that I represent, but more importantly, on behalf of the future generations that have a lot to learn, that they're going to be able to do that because of you. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Supervisor Campos. And seeing no other names on the roster for the amendments proposed by Supervisor Marr and that were seconded, colleagues, can we take these amendments without objection? Without objection, those amendments passed. And on the and colleagues, on the amendments proposed by Supervisor Wiener and Yee, colleagues, can we take that amendment without objection? Without objection, that amendment passes. And on the underlying item, Madam Clerk, can you please call the roll?
On item 14.
Excuse me, can we have order in the chamber, please? Thank you. Madam Clerk, can you please call the roll on the item as amended?
Supervisor Farrell.
Aye.
Farrell, aye. Supervisor Kim. Kim, aye. Supervisor Marr.
Aye.
Marr, aye. Supervisor Tang.
Aye.
Tang, aye. Supervisor Wiener.
Aye.
Wiener, aye. Supervisor Yee.
Aye.
Yee, aye. Supervisor Avalos.
Aye.
Avalos, aye. Supervisor Breed.
Aye.
Breed, aye. Supervisor Campos.
Aye.
Campos, aye. Supervisor Christensen.
Aye.
Christensen, aye. Supervisor Cohen.
Aye.
Cohen, aye. There are 11 ayes.
The resolution is adopted unanimously. Madam Clerk, can you please call item number 15?
Item 15 is a resolution to determine that the transfer...
Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen, we still have business to conduct, so if you are going to exit the chambers, please do so quietly, and no talking in the chambers while we're trying to conduct business. Thank you.
Take a break.
Item 15, please.
A resolution to determine that the transfer of a Type 21 off-sale general license from 2887 Bryant Street to 2111 Harrison Street will serve the public convenience.
Take a break.
We're going to take a 5-minute recess.
SF Gov TV, San Francisco Government Television.
All right, folks, we are back to conduct our regular business at the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. Madam Clerk, were you able to call item number 15?
Yes, Madam President. Item 15 is the liquor license transfer for 2111 Harrison Street.
Okay, roll call vote.
On item 15, Supervisor Farrell. Farrell, aye. Supervisor Kim. Kim, aye. Supervisor Marr. Marr absent. Supervisor Tang.
Aye.
Tang, aye. Supervisor Weiner.
Aye.
Weiner, aye. Supervisor Yee.
Aye.
Yee, aye. Supervisor Avalos.
Aye.
Avalos, aye. Supervisor Breed.
Aye.
Breed, aye. Supervisor Campos.
Aye.
Campos, aye. Supervisor Christensen.
Aye.
Christensen, aye. Supervisor Cohen.
Aye.
Cohen, aye. There are 10 ayes.
Okay, this resolution is adopted unanimously. Let's go to roll call for introductions.
First up to introduce new business, Supervisor Farrell.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. So, colleagues, I have one item today that has been the process of a months-long discussions with people inside and outside of City Hall, and an issue that's very near and dear to my heart. Our city parks and our open spaces are a big factor and drive the quality of life that we enjoy here in San Francisco. From Golden Gate Park to Chrissy Field to Dolores and McLaren Park, these parks provide a place for recreation, relaxation, and serve as a point of pride for our entire city. They are the great equalizer and allow for any person from anywhere to access, use, and enjoy whichever city park they prefer. As our city continues to grow, the use of our city parks is at an all-time high, and rightfully so. And our Recreation and Parks Department is working tirelessly to address the nuts and bolts issues that our residents care about and deserve. Unfortunately, funding for our Rec and Park Department has not kept pace with the needs and issues that needs to be addressed in our neighborhood parks. Recent analysis from the Parks Alliance has shown that funding for the Rec and Park Department has lagged even during a period when our local economy is strong and showing signs of further growth. Just as an example, in the year 2000, our Rec and Park Department received 2.1% of the general fund. In this past fiscal year, the department only received 1.3% of that general fund. A recent analysis done by our Controller's Office showed that the Rec and Park Department is nearly entirely request or emergency driven. Over 99% of the maintenance work done by our Rec and Park Department is done on an emergency basis. So less than 1% of our maintenance efforts in our Rec and Park Department is for preventative maintenance work. Clearly, we need to address these issues if we want to ensure clean and safe neighborhood parks for our residents and for our visitors. So over the past few months, along with members of the Parks Alliance, I've been meeting with community and neighborhood groups throughout our city to get feedback directly from residents about what they want to see improved in their own neighborhood parks. In meeting after meeting, I continue to hear from residents who want to see the nuts and bolts infrastructure addressed, more programming options at our recreation centers, and even the potential to acquire more open space. It's with this community feedback in meeting after meeting and a community-driven ballot process that I'm formally introducing today for next June's 2016 primary election, a ballot initiative with the support of my co-sponsors, Supervisor Julie Christensen, Supervisor Scott Weiner, Supervisor Katie Tang, Supervisors Eric Marr, and Supervisor Norman Yee, and with the support of our own Mayor Lee. The voter initiative is a charter amendment that would guarantee just over $350 million in additional new funding for our Rec and Park Department over the next 15 years to address our structural budget shortfall that exists and to ensure clean and safe parks and open spaces across our city. This measure means that net of anticipated employee costs, our Rec and Park Department will see over $200 million of new funding over the next 15 years. In addition to new funding, the measure also provides for guidance and accountability measures, so we make sure, and our residents of San Francisco make sure, that the additional funding that we are spending in our Rec and Park Department is going to resources and neighborhood needs that are very transparent. This measure mandates that the department periodically update their strategic plan and provides a mechanism that allows the Rec and Park Commission and Prozac to review and approve the department's strategic plan, which will allow for appropriate feedback and input to the public. And to ensure that these new dollars are spent wisely and efficiently, the measure mandates that the City Services Auditor periodically conduct a performance audit to ensure that the goals are being hit that were mandated in the department's strategic plan. And I will also say that this set-aside was designed in a very financially responsible manner. It is a slow ramp over the upcoming years with an additional $3 million per year over the next 10 years. And in any recessionary period, the increases that are anticipated in this measure will go away for that year. I am a firm believer that clean and safe parks enhance the quality of life for our residents and provide incredible economic and health benefits for all of our residents. Our world-class park system, which it is, deserves a sustainable funding source to make the badly needed improvements that we have today, everything from fixing the broken swings to adding more gardeners and custodians and creating more programming options for our neighborhood parks. I want to ensure that as our city continues to grow, that future generations of San Franciscans don't have to worry about whether we're going to add more open space or whether we'll be able to replace the rusty monkey bars at their neighborhood parks. This measure will guarantee that improvements and upgrades to every neighborhood park in San Francisco will come in the future to benefit all San Franciscans. I want to thank a number of people who have worked incredibly hard on this over the past few months in anticipation of all the hard work into next year. First of all, to my staff, Jess Montejano and Margot Kelly in particular, who have gone to so many neighborhood meetings with me, and the Parks Alliance, as well as drafting this legislation. To my co-sponsors here on the Board of Supervisors, thank you. To the San Francisco Parks Alliance, I see Kelly Nice, the incredible chairman of their board, to Matt O'Grady, I see Rachel Norton, Todd David, and their staff. They've done an incredible job advocating for our parks, and we are lucky to have them. To Mayor Lee and his budget team, they were integral in this and these negotiations, and I thank them, and to our controller, Ben Rosenfield, who was incredibly helpful during this process, to our Rec and Park Department, and the countless community residents for their support and their feedback. We do all understand the benefits and importance of our city's parks, and I look forward to getting out in the neighborhoods to sell this proposal and earn our voter support. And colleagues, I hope to earn everyone's support as well when the time comes. The rest I submit.
Thank you, Supervisor Farrell. Supervisor Kim.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. As I had mentioned earlier today I am introducing the Safer Schools Sexual Assault Task Force in conjunction with a major announcement today by District Attorney George Gascon, Chief Sir, University of San Francisco President Paul Fitzgerald, and the UCSF Interim Chief of Police Mike Denson, who agreed today to establish a memorandum of understanding with the city's educational institution to combat sexual assault on college campuses together and support victims who bravely come out and report. In March, I shared the story of the dreaded phone call that many women think about my freshman year of college from my best friend in high school. She called to tell me that the previous night someone she had met at a party followed her into the bathroom and raped her. She tried to push him off, but he wouldn't stop. When he finally left the bathroom, stunned, scared, and horrified, she left the party. She didn't tell anyone until she called me the next day. I was enraged, but sadly, I knew that this was going to happen. Not necessarily to her, but to someone I knew, or perhaps even me. I'd read the stats in high school before I went to college. 1 out of 4, 1 out of 5, 1 out of 7 women get raped in college. It didn't matter which ratio was accurate. The odds were too high. What I wasn't expecting from this experience was how helpless I felt and how disempowered she felt. Was there a person or a place on campus that we could call? Was there a community organization off campus that could tell us what to do? And if we did call, what would even happen? I didn't encourage her to report it because at 18, I was already painfully aware of the fact that the system wasn't designed to protect us. She would be victimized over and over again, asked what she did, how much she drank, if she flirted with him, implied consent. And I felt, and I still continue to feel, rage and frustration that the person who did this to her and other perpetrators like him would never be held accountable. My friend joined the 9 out of 10 women on school campuses who know the person who assaulted them. She was also among the 80% of college women who are raped but do not report their assault to the police. We only need to look at the statistics to understand why. When 40% of our colleges and universities can say that they have not investigated not a single sexual assault in 5 years, I think the reasons are crystal clear why young people in overwhelming numbers are not seeking help and why sexual predators are not being held accountable. I consider myself a strong woman and a feminist and an individual that fights for justice. But I have to be honest, I'm not certain that I would report a sexual assault if I was a college student today. I'm too familiar with the re-victimization and post-trauma that often follows with reporting. And so I am more obligated as a policymaker to do better and ensure that we have a system that I would feel safe within, reporting the crime and violence against women. I also want to recognize the many young, brave women, survivors and advocates like Grandma Lee, who we had today, but also countless women on college campuses who are speaking up and telling their stories because they believe we can and must transform the system despite what people call them and what they're accused of. We can end sexual violence on campuses in this generation. So the resolution I am introducing today will form a Safer Schools Sexual Assault Task Force. With the federal and state legislations concerning on-campus sexual assault in progress, San Francisco must be prepared to act decisively to establish the best practices to prevent violence on our campus in the first place and to protect our students throughout our institutions of higher learning. But regardless of the passage of the Campus Accountability Act at the federal level or the state law which just passed, the benefit and impact of any law will only be effective if fully implemented at the local level. The task force will provide the city with a blueprint on the concrete actions that the city should take to help schools fully utilize all the new and existing laws on sexual violence to make school communities a reality. We can build a campus culture that is safe for all students. It's on all of us in San Francisco to say that we can eradicate sexual assault on our campus. We look forward to working with the many partners. We're very excited with the higher education institutions like UCSF and USF that have committed to the Memorandum of Understanding, that are going to work collaboratively and recognize jurisdiction with SFPD and also the UCSF police to make sure that we are supporting women and other victims who are coming out about assault on campuses, and that we are working with them every step of the way. And the rest I submit.
Thank you, Supervisor Kim. Supervisor Marr?
Thank you. Colleagues, I'll be hosting a tenants' rights town hall. We call it Our Richmond No Evictions. It'll be held Saturday, September 26th at the Richmond Rec Center on 18th and Clement. It's from 1 to 3 p.m. Tenant rights organizations, including the Housing Rights Committee, Tenants Together, the San Francisco Community Land Trust, and ACE, formerly ACORN, will be there to provide information on what tenants who are facing evictions can do. The Our Richmond No Evictions Town Hall is part of my office's broader strategy with the tenant movement, which includes the Small Sites Acquisition Fund and the establishment of a Richmond District Services Center that will include tenant counseling, multilingual, to support Richmond District residents as our neighborhood struggles with the citywide eviction and displacement crisis. The displacement of families, seniors, and low and moderate income residents has been growing over the past year in the Richmond and has to be dealt with in a multifaceted and comprehensive manner. This gathering is a great way to bring tenants together to share information and empower them. Lastly, I'm asking the board to end our meeting in honor of a tremendous labor leader, David Novogradsky, the former professional and technical engineers, Local 21 executive director. Many of our staffs are members of Local 21. Mr. Novogradsky was one of my mentors and a close friend. He was 82 years old. He's survived by his wife, Karen Schur, his children, my friends Ellen Novogradsky and Stephanie Gott, but also Seth Novogradsky and his grandchildren, Avidan, or Avi as we call him, Hava Novogradsky of San Francisco. David Novogradsky was a leader who contributed much to the growth and strength of Local 21 during his tenure from 1981 through 2006. That's a 25-year period. Under his leadership, Local 21 grew from 400 members to representing more than 8,500 members. That's what I call building your base and your membership. He spent his life and career fighting for workers' rights. He previously worked for a number of other unions, including AFSCME, SEIU, the American Federation of Teachers, or AFT, as well as for the AFL-CIO Los Angeles Orange County's organizing committee. He served as chair of the Council of Engineers and Scientists Organizations, or CESO, and as Western Vice President of the International Federation of Professional and Technical Engineers. He was a delegate to Bay Area and Southern California Labor Councils and an executive board member of the San Francisco Labor Council. He has been a university and college instructor at a number of institutions, including Rutgers, San Francisco State University, and San Francisco City College. He led a long and fruitful life, inspiring many to join the labor movement and to support social and economic justice issues. Thank you. The rest I'll submit.
Thank you, Supervisor Marr. Supervisor Weiner.
Submit.
Supervisor Yee.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. First of all, I want to thank Supervisor Farrow for bringing the potential charter amendment on Rec and Park funding. I just want to announce that we're going to have a ribbon cutting of some new open space in District 7 along Ocean Avenue that's associated with the one of our public library branches. And working with PUC as a partner, we were able to expand the garden area to about 4 times the capacity of what it is now. First, any expansion of open space in District 7 probably in like 100 years or something. So colleagues, as we all know, small businesses are vulnerable, invaluable to our city and our community. They provide approximately 283,000 jobs in our local economy and offer a wide array of services to our residents and visitors. I know that our city is committed to improving services and streamlining the process so that business owners are not overburdened by red tape. One of the issues that small businesses have to deal with are incessant fees for various permits, license, or services. Over the past few months, I have been working with the Office of the Controller to look into fees that could be potentially eliminated due to their lack of use and that are outdated in nature. There are quite a few fees that we collect from businesses that have a very minimal impact on our revenue while adding to the burden of what business owners already face. Today, I am making a formal request to the city attorney to draft legislation that would eliminate a number of these archaic and insignificant business fees. I hope that through this process we will be able to identify other ways to further support our local small businesses. Thank you, and the rest I submit.
Thank you, Supervisor Yee. Supervisor Avalos.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. Today, colleagues, I'm introducing, along with President Breed, Supervisor Campos, Kim, Marr, and Weiner, the bike yield ordinance. This has been in the works for a few months, but it's an idea that's been around for many, many years, especially as we've seen a huge increase in cycling in San Francisco. Personally, I've been cycling in the city since 1992. That's well before we had a bike lane on Valencia Street, which was our first bike lane in San Francisco. That bike lane went in 1995. I'm also a driver, and I'm a ped user. I'm a pedestrian, and I'm a muni rider as well. I use all forms of modes of transportation. It's important that all of us, as we're using our streets, that we're well aware of the dangers that we can create, and the people who are very fearful of those dangers as well, and especially that we have a hierarchy of how we want to use our streets and our sidewalks, and our pedestrians are at the top of our hierarchy for safety on our public right-of-way. So this legislation, there's been a lot of hysteria, I think, that's whipped up about this legislation, about what it does, and it's really about requiring cyclists to yield at stop signs, requiring cyclists to yield to pedestrians and other vehicles at stop signs. So we really want to affirm that we're promoting safe cycling in San Francisco. This legislation is also about shifting traffic enforcement resources to the highest risk violations on our streets. And so a high-risk violation is a cyclist that blows through a stop sign. And we're not telling the police department that they should not enforce a cyclist who blows through a stop sign. In fact, I want the police department to ticket a cyclist who is bicycling very unsafe and making other people who use our sidewalks and our streets in an unsafe way. And so when we actually focus on these higher risk violations, we're actually doing the work to empower us to maximize our Vision Zero effort. When we're focused on the greatest violations, the greatest risks, we know that we're using our resources in the best kind of way. And so for cyclists, this legislation says it'll be a low priority to enforce ticketing on cyclists who come to a stop sign with a yield. They can come to a stop or they can slow down, but as long as they're recognizing that there are pedestrians that are there and giving the right of way to pedestrians and other vehicles, that they should not be ticketed. That to me is actually freeing up the ability for law enforcement to do the greater work of protecting our streets for everyone on the higher risk activities. This legislation, of course, is supported by the San Francisco Bike Coalition, and I'm happy that they're on board. But they also came on board after we originally had talked about legislating it, and they had to go through their own deliberation as well to come to its support. Also, the Pedestrian Safety Advisory Committee of the San Francisco MTA has come out in support of this legislation. The Ped Safety Advisory Committee has also given us some good ideas about how we can reinforce this legislation as well, and I'm considering their recommendations. Some of them talk about the kind of way that cyclists should come to stop signs and how they should slow down and what kind of distance they should give to pedestrians who they're given the right of way to. And I think those are really important things to consider as we have this legislation come forward at the Board of Supervisors. I was really disappointed to see that the chief of police has come out what appears to be against this legislation, and I really feel that if we were to be really clear about what is the highest priority for law enforcement on traffic, on enforcing traffic on our streets, that we were actually helping them to do their jobs better and to protect all of us by moving them on to the higher risk violations. So, colleagues, this will come before us in next probably in November, and I really want to urge your open-mindedness and your support. We are seeing cycling increase dramatically in San Francisco, from especially where it was 10 years ago, and that trend is going to continue. We have to figure out how to promote safer cycling and also to help people understand that cycling is actually an activity that all of us can enjoy and don't necessarily have to fear, especially when we put real clear guidelines about what is safe cycling, which this legislation does. So, colleagues, when it comes to it, I hope you have your support. And thanks again for my co-sponsors to the legislation.
Thank you, Supervisor Avalos. Supervisor Campos.
Thank you very much, Madam Clerk. I know that we have a number of folks in the audience who are here specifically for this item, and I want to thank them for their patience in being here. But today it is my privilege to introduce a set of proposals, a package of 3 different proposals that address the tragedy that happened recently here in San Francisco, which is the tragic killing of Catherine Steinle. Following that tragedy, you have people like Donald Trump and quite frankly, other elected officials throughout this country who have joined extremist groups in scapegoating immigrants. They have made it a point of stirring up hate and racism throughout this country. And so the proposal, the 3-pronged proposal that I'm putting forward today is an effort to stop the hate, to stop the fear-mongering, and to actually have a meaningful, thoughtful discussion about what reforms are needed, not only to protect the safety of all San Franciscans, but to do so in a way that is consistent with the values and principles of this city. For the last few weeks, I have been working with the community, and many immigrant rights groups and organizations that have been working on these issues for years. We have also been working with our district attorney, George Gascon, and I also want to thank my colleagues on the Board of Supervisors who are joining me today in co-sponsoring this effort. Supervisor Avalos, Supervisor Marr. And let me talk a little bit about what we're proposing. First, we need to address the issue of the fact that the incident that took place happened because you have a gun that got in the wrong hands. So the first piece of this proposal, which will happen next week, will be the introduction of an ordinance that addresses a loophole that allows weapons, guns that ultimately belong to law enforcement to end up in the hands of people who should not have them. The fact is that this is not an isolated incident. Unfortunately, in the last few weeks, we have seen at least a couple of incidents where guns that belong to law enforcement personnel were stolen and were found to be in the possession of people who had no business having them. So we have an ordinance that will be introduced next week that will close a loophole in the existing law by ensuring that public safety officers, that they actually secure their guns in lockboxes when they are off duty. Right now, you have a requirement that if they are on duty, that they lock those guns, but nothing applies to the time when they are off duty. The second point, and this is a very important point, I want to thank George Gascon for working with my office to make this happen, is the fact that we need to stop the needless transfers of people from immigration to our county jail. If you look at what happened with this tragedy, if the policy that I'm proposing had been in place, we believe that this tragedy would have been prevented. I have been working with District Attorney Gascon to create a common sense procedure for our local law enforcement agencies to check in about outstanding warrants before requesting that people be transferred to San Francisco. This resolution urges the District Attorney, the San Francisco Police Department, the Adult Probation Department, and the Sheriff to develop policies and procedures to communication prior to seeking the transfer of an inmate on an outstanding warrant to decide whether the transfer will lead to an actual persecution. What we know today is that if this procedure had been in place, and in this case the Sheriff had contacted the District Attorney, the District Attorney's office would have informed the Sheriff that in this case there would be no prosecution, and therefore the transfer would not have happened. The third piece, and this is a very important piece, and let me say this, that we are actually following the lead of the local San Francisco Democratic Party in this very important point. And that is that in the midst of this anti-immigrant hysteria that has been stirred up by all these extremist groups and individuals, we in San Francisco need to recommit to upholding due process and building community confidence in law enforcement. To that end, we are following the lead of the San Francisco Democratic County Central Committee, which just this past week unanimously passed a resolution that urges the Board of Supervisors for the City and County of San Francisco not to participate in the Priority Enforcement Program, also known as PEP. We commend the Democratic Party for their action, and consistent with that call on this board, we believe that we need to follow that example. And so I have a second resolution that makes it clear that San Francisco remains a sanctuary city, and that being a sanctuary city in this case means no cooperation with the federal government through involvement with PEP. PEP is essentially the same thing as the so-called Secure Communities, or ESCOM. It's a program that we in this board have actually opposed before. In fact, going back to 2010, the Board of Supervisors took a very clear stance against ESCOM. And because we did that, cities and counties throughout other parts of the country followed suit. We have an opportunity to once again take the lead and make it clear that PEP is simply ESCOM with a different name. The federal government has tried to put lipstick on a pig, but the pig remains a pig. And in this case, it is important for San Francisco to call it out. Again, I want to thank Supervisor Avalos, Supervisor Marr for their support. I believe that what we need when you look at this situation is thoughtful, rational policy discussions that provide solutions that do not try to fan the flames of hatred as we have seen throughout this country. I am hopeful, colleagues, that as this process of reviewing this proposal moves forward, to have the support of the entire Board of Supervisors. I believe it's important for us to continue to remain united in our support of sanctuary. And I also believe that it's important for us to provide some commonsensical solutions to this tragedy. What this proposal has in it would have actually prevented this tragedy from happening. It is time for real solutions, not more hatred. The rest I submit, and I also want to acknowledge the tremendous work of the coalition that has been working with my office, Supervisor Avalos and his staff, and in particular Hillary Ronan of my office, who has spent a great deal of time. And with that, before I close and submit, I want to ask all the people who are in the chamber to support this effort to please stand up. Thank you very much for being here. Your presence, even though it cannot be heard because we can't speak, it can be felt. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Campos. Supervisor Christensen.
I want to thank Supervisor Farrell for his proposal expanding funding for the Recreation and Park Department. Most people know I've spent a lot of the last 20 years building and remodeling parks in District 3. I recently visited 2 of them that we completed a decade ago. I find them in need of repair. So it's somewhat disheartening for us advocates to spend years. In this case, each park took 6 years from concept to opening to find that regular maintenance does not keep them in their original pristine condition. So I look forward to moving ahead with a proposal that will fund reasonable maintenance for our park system. Today, I am introducing substitute legislation regarding our neighborhood preference program. The existing substitute ordinance expands the displaced tenants category to include tenants displaced through no-fault eviction, fire, natural disasters, and for tenants living in units with affordability contracts, expanding a preference in new and affordable housing in San Francisco. It also creates a third preference for residents in the neighborhood, defined as the supervisorial district. The substitute legislation that I'm introducing today makes this program stronger by expanding neighborhood to include a 1/2 mile buffer around any affordable unit project. It adds a priority for tenants displaced from the neighborhood, and it ensures a minimum of 6 years for displaced tenants to be eligible for the priority. I'm also introducing an accept and expend for the PUC for additional funds from the Solano County Water Agency for implementation of a regional water conservation program. This is funding for the PUC to incentivize the installation of high-efficiency toilets, and for PUC to promote water conservation to help meet its goal of developing 10 million gallons per day in conservation, recycled water, and groundwater in San Francisco by 2018. I'm also happy to join the mayor in establishing a fund to expand the Navigation Center program to accept private matching funds specifically for this program. I'm a great fan of the Navigation Center. The current center, which has operated only 5 months, has processed 200 homeless people, 60 of whom are now housed, 36 of whom have been sent home to family and friends. This was done with $3 million in donated funds. The fund that the mayor is proposing we establish can receive donations for additional navigation centers that will then be matched by the city to help further this productive program. The rest I submit.
Thank you, Supervisor Christensen. Supervisor Cohen.
You submit.
Madam President, seeing no other names on the roster, that concludes the introduction of new business.
Thank you. Madam Clerk, can you please read public comment?
At this time, the public may comment generally to the entire Board of Supervisors for up to 2 minutes on items within the subject matter jurisdiction of the Board, including the items on the adoption without reference to committee calendar, items 18 through 25.
First
Public
speaker.
comment. Sorry, Madam President, I took a breath. Public comment is not allowed on items where the public comment requirement has been satisfied, as is the case with the items 1 through 15, on the consent, new and unfinished business, or with the committee reports. Pursuant to the Board's rules, direct your remarks to the Board as a whole, not to individual supervisors, and nor to the audience. Speakers using interpretation assistance will be allowed twice the amount of time. If you would like to display your document on the overhead projector, please clearly state such and then remove the document when you would like the screen to return to live coverage of the meeting.
Thank you. First speaker, please.
Members of the Board of Supervisors, Ray Hartz, Director, San Francisco Open Government, and on the screen you will see Order of Determination number 15038, which reads in part as follows. The Sunshine Ordinance Task Force fines President London Breed in violation of the Sunshine Ordinance Section 6725A for failure to respond to an immediate disclosure request in a timely and complete manner. In addition, the Sunshine Ordinance Task Force fines President London Breed, Board of Supervisors, in violation of Administrative Code Section 6721E, which is also the Sunshine Ordinance, for failure to send a knowledgeable representative to the Sunshine Ordinance Task Force. Thomas Aquinas teaches that willful ignorance of what one ought to know is a mortal sin. And I don't think any of you who won't look at me or doing your emails and your games or whatever you're playing there, basically, I have a hard time understanding how an elected official who took an oath to support and defend the Constitution would so blatantly and knowingly violate the citizens' rights under the law. But I've got 24 orders of determination that show constant elected officials, appointed officials, boards and commissions that do exactly that. Because basically they consider, once they put their backsides in those seats, that they are somehow above the law. She knew this was a legal request and failed to do anything for 4 months, and then basically presented a thing saying, we have no responsive documents. She could have done that on day one, but she chose not to. So this was a knowing and willful violation, and I will be filing a complaint
Thank you very much. Next
with
speaker,
the Ethics
please.
Commission against her.
Next speaker, please.
Hi, my name is Paulette Brown, and I like to use the overhead. Again, I'm here concerning my son, Aubrey Castro, who was murdered August 14, 2006, to a semi-automatic gun. 30 rounds of bullets left that gun into my son. We were just talking about, hearing you talking about gun violence and people that are getting guns in the wrong hands. And I was also concerned about the person that's getting the memorial. We're talking about a memorial. why we can't have a memorial for our children. I'm not knocking Kate and her parents because she's going through the same thing that I'm going through. Why can't we have a wall for our children that have been murdered on these senseless streets? My child was an innocent boy, my innocent boy who died on the street saving someone else's life. He wasn't in a gang, and that's known by everybody. Former Mayor Gavin Newsom mentions this in his article, that my son was not in a gang. And he says that he knows who killed my son. The DA know who killed my son. The police know who killed my son. What do we do about it? How come we can't have a wall for our children, for our innocent children? My son was not in a gang, and people of color are being stigmatized for that, and I have to fight for that so that my son's name won't be disgraced, let alone anybody else's name. How come we can't have a memorial also, a memorial wall for our children? I've been hearing this all since I've been sitting here, that everyone's getting a memorial, but our children don't.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Thank you, President Breed and other members of the cabal. My name is Christopher Dahl, and I live at 6th and Howard, 10 blocks and less than 14 meters from sea level. I rise to comment about injustice. A search found the following words, among others, as being the equivalent of justice: fairness, objectivity, honesty. We can describe injustice as any situation lacking those qualities. Where might I have seen injustice? Could I possibly have seen injustice in these chambers? You continue to let Google butts exploit public space for private privilege. That's unfair. That is injustice. You continue to do things like sign long-term contracts for short-term tasks. That's not the result of an objective analysis. That is injustice. And there is honesty and truthfulness. One of you could have offered us truth by questioning one among you who said that all life on Earth will die if humans burn all fossil fuel. Wrong, people. The green plants would just love it. Honestly, haven't you been listening when I talk about balance? Don't you understand when I talk about the balance of the carbon cycle? Don't you remember that I've described how green plants suck in what our smokestacks spew out? And the truth is that animals take in oxygen and put out carbon dioxide, and plants take in carbon dioxide and put out oxygen, a working balance which has been lost and must be restored. Anything less is injustice. Thank you, President Breed.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
How many of you want to make a profit? All you have to do is buy a radio station and put on the Alex Jones Show. You'll make a huge profit. I was listening to InfoWars on Sunday, and he mentioned that Alex Jones lost 70 of his stations around 9/11 because he refused to stop talking about Building 7 and other facts regarding controlled demolition. And there was a station on Orlando, Florida, that within 2 or 3 months, he rose to the top ratings above Rush Limbaugh and everybody. And then, since there's 6 mega corporations that control 90% of the news media, they panicked, sold the station, changed the format, and it's doing music or sports or something now. But there's been a huge cover-up. The CIA, it's on record in Congress, has been influencing NBC, CBS, and ABC to propagandize the American public so we won't know the facts concerning the news. But it really does go to show, as I said before, if you want to make a profit, buy a radio station and put on the Alex Jones Show. It is possible that a man is 10 times better than another man. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were 10 times better And he actually is. I go back and forth from KOMY 1340 with Alex Jones, and then when he does his commercials, I switch back to KSFO 560 and listen to Rush for 10 minutes or so, and then it's back to Alex Jones. It's about 90%. But you know, although I love talk radio, when we come to the Word of God, the Bible says in due time, Christ died for the ungodly. When the fullness of time was come, Galatians 4:4, when the fullness of time was come, God sent his Son.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
I'm going to put this ad about the healthcare system.
SFG TV, please.
Yes, so my name is Toby Johnson, and I'm talking about the healthcare system that we're public and the cure to cancer, and I haven't got money or nothing to explain with my kind of policy and my benefits, and this is kind of throwing everything off in the world that, you know, we have, and the healthcare system with housing that we have here is not even, you know, to explain to anybody to understand it. And I don't even, you know, if you explain to, there's a governor office where the governor, I have not, you know, got any kind of information or nothing about it. Like, I've been doing it since 2006. There's supposed to be some things that I do in the office, and I haven't got received nothing. I'm like, they want to throw me out of San Francisco and not even, you know, put the example for cure cancer. And I've been, you know, trying to get a job replacement and trying to seek into, you know, other benefits. And I'm going to City College. And I guess what you're trying to say is that I need more education or something. But this has been really, you know, if you want to get out faster, you know, is really like ignoring a real factor about cure cancer. And it's been putting everything off, and especially when there's supposed to be, you know, governor, you know, office that's supposed to be helping people out for, you know, contracts and policies and you know.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, please.
Tom Gilberti, 2000 South Beach Marine Apartments. Thank you. Another heat wave we just passed, sleeping with windows open, balancing air with noise. If you've got quiet, enjoy it. Noise is increasing and it's being neglected, maybe next to mayor. Previously, I requested a formula to get 3 minutes for public comment. I'm willing to compromise. How about 2 minutes and 30 seconds? We are citizens. Third, let's do housing. 5 points. Ellis Act evictions, let's ban them, give them an appeal. No cause evictions, no fault evictions banned with an appeal. Now let's go outside the box quickly. Market rate rents frozen. I just met a gal, 4 years in South Beach Marina apartment, the 4th year of a $450 rent increase. Sent her away. She was a gem, a black African-American woman in tech. Gone. We have to think, we'd like to reset the rents also for long-term residents. What's a long-term resident? 8-10 years. And then while we're freezing the rents for market rate, we are establishing a rent control for the entire city. Fourth, renters receive a share of every property sale. That helps them move. Fifth, community housing for all new. Instead of 60% or more for market rate housing, 30% for market rate housing, 30% for what I'm going to call zip codes, people living in the area. They get preferential into these houses. Also, maybe 10% could get from a city zip code. And there's more. I would love more time.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Good afternoon, Supervisors. My name is Luis Avalos. I am the current chairman of the San Francisco Youth Commission. I wanted to give public comment today because I'd like to personally give my gratitude to all of you who rejected Fox News' attempts to get a commentary out of you guys because of the Steinle family incident. It's truly sad that one family's tragic loss has been so politicized and used to incriminate immigrants such as myself and my peers. And just hearing Supervisor Campos' resolutions and ordinances today, I know down the line there may be some details that may not be as agreeable or might be questionable. But with the fact that some of you had very unfriendly encounters with these reporters gives me hope that you guys always keep the best in mind for immigrants. And like Supervisor Breed said, let us heal wounds and not reopen them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, please.
Otto Duffy, Northern Market resident nearby. I appreciated the memorial that's going to go up for the Comfort Women. I actually have a friend who's the daughter of one, and interestingly, and bringing the problem embarrassingly closer to home, she's the child of an American GI, and the American experience there, which happened just 5 years after World War II. And so I appreciate that we're going to bring this closer to home, and we're going to start looking at what happens to women when they go to college. But what's probably much more likely to get you a sexual assault is if you're a woman and you go into the military. So I think we should start to look at that too, the women that don't go to college. And actually, if you start to think about it, I think about 60% of women will never go or will not go to college or will not graduate from college. We have to start seeing, in my neighborhood, you see all sorts of people who, for one reason or another, are sidelined to a lower income lifestyle. How is that happening? So I think we just, obviously the Comfort Women, I appreciate that very much. The Pope is in the Western Hemisphere in the United States today, and I think it's a wonderful thing that happened today.
Thank you. Are there any other members of the public who'd like to provide public comment at this time? Seeing none, public comment is closed. And Madam Clerk, can you please read the adoption without committee reference items?
Items 18 through 25 are being considered for immediate adoption without committee reference. A single roll call vote may enact these items. A member may object, sever an item, and have it considered separately.
Does any member want to sever any of the items? Seeing none, Madam Clerk, can you please call the roll?
On items 18 through 25, Supervisor Farrell.
Aye.
Farrell, aye. Supervisor Kim. Kim, aye. Supervisor Marr.
Aye.
Marr, aye. Supervisor Tang.
Aye.
Tang, aye. Supervisor Wiener.
Aye.
Wiener, aye. Supervisor Yee.
Aye.
Yee, aye. Supervisor Avalos.
Aye.
Avalos, aye. Supervisor Breed.
Aye.
Breed, aye. Supervisor Campos.
Aye.
Campos, aye. Supervisor Christensen.
Aye.
Christensen, aye. Supervisor Cohen.
Aye.
Cohen, aye. There are 11 ayes.
Those items are approved unanimously. Okay, Madam Clerk, will you please read the in memoriams?
Yes, today's meeting will be adjourned in memory of the following beloved individual. On behalf of Supervisor Marr, for the late Mr. David Novogradsky.
Okay, colleagues, that brings us to the end of our agenda. Madam Clerk, is there any other business before us this evening?
That concludes our business for today, Madam President.
Seeing none, we are adjourned. Thank you, everyone.